Chapter 926. Wuxia 06 was located at the edge of the original infrastructure module of the blocking position, fortress. It was a special passageway for entry and exit, similar to the role of a city gate. However, it was impossible to pass through medium and large-sized vehicles, so the transfer of the freezing device became inevitable. Under the special rules and environment, all orderly and precise work would obtain considerable bonuses. The difficulty of simply installing the module was not high, and the progress was extremely fast. Plus, there were 2 senior maintenance personnel with the most experience in the blocking position. They were remotely commanding and guiding, so Luonan and the others could calmly discuss the technology of the freezing device and the corresponding gossip. Is it a device similar to time freezing? How can it be that exaggerated? It's just an instant freezing into a state of imminent danger. Plus, it's impossible to use it without a certain foundation and prerequisites that are extremely expensive. Liang Lu's family background was decent. For him to say something like, extremely expensive, the price of the so-called prerequisites could be imagined. Luonan went, oh. He didn't care about the price and the like. He just used the transfer and maintenance module blueprints to try to deduce the appearance of the freezing device. It felt like a space-time configuration design. It was quite rare these days. Concentrate. Adjust the parameters and test it again. You need to have the right attitude when dealing with these heavily injured people. Officer Xianzhu's mouth always tasted weird. He was remotely commanding through the temporary group channel, but it was practically useless. Instead, he wasted a relatively ideal surgical window. He could only continue to be a cripple. He was vexed right now, and it seemed like he was looking for trouble. After lecturing Luonan and Liang Lu, he turned to complain to the other side. There are hundreds of transport routes, and they chose the worst one. Passing through from this side, they can't at least guarantee the consistency of the rules and environment. Including the forward position, is there any place with more chaotic rules and environment than this fissure tunnel inside and outside of the relay base? It's like a wildfire on the side of the road. How can there be an opportunity to choose calmly on the battlefield? The other person sent to supervise and control was Lieutenant Go Yi. He no longer bickered with Xianzhu in the temporary group channel. He just discussed the matter as it stood. Rescuing and transporting the heavily injured is never easy. Due to the awkward location, there is no way to pass through the chaotic battlefield and enter the shortcut. It is possible to transfer through a fissure. No matter what, this was an extremely important mission. Otherwise, Field Officer Meng Fan would not have specifically ordered Go Yi and Xianzhu to supervise the work after sending out the maintenance soldiers. At the same time, inside Wuxia 06, there was a platoon of combat soldiers on standby. It was said that they were there to provide support in the event of an unexpected situation. This stance, if I didn't know better, I would have thought that it was, cough. Lieutenant Go Yi promptly interrupted Xianzhu's unspoken words and forcefully shifted the focus back to the technical aspect. The replacement transport vehicle will enter the transfer channel in 20 seconds and dock with the temporary module for debugging. From the preset data, there shouldn't be any problems. Right now, the variable is the transport vehicle that drove out from the battlefield. Oh, the person in charge of the transport is someone I know. Who is it? Lieutenant Shangmin, her? She's reliable. This was the first time Luonan saw Xianzhu express her trust in someone so resolutely and decisively. Go Ye's attitude was more or less the same. Lieutenant Shang's technical level is obviously trustworthy, but we need to communicate in time to determine the details of the rules and environment. Do you want to do it or do I? Xianzhu responded snappily, you guys are all lieutenants. Why should I join in the fun? Go Ye laughed. If it weren't for the fact that your brain isn't working, it would be best to have you go over and coordinate. Xianzhu said resentfully, should I go and let her step on me? It's necessary to provide support and coordinate from the front. An unfamiliar voice abruptly cut into the temporary group channel. Holy crap. Xianzhu clearly jumped in fright. Right now, the identity of the speaker naturally appeared in the channel. He was labeled Yen Xian, and his rank was that of a lieutenant. He was also the person in charge of the internal standby combat squad of Wuxia 06. For a lieutenant to be in charge of a 10-man combat squad meant that he had either committed a crime, or he had a high position but a low assignment. The squad under him was a first-class elite. Yen Xian's situation belonged to the latter. Go Yi was very polite to Yen Xian. Lieutenant Yen, you mean? Yen Xian was also very straightforward. Swap vehicles. They've already begun to station in, but the battlefield transport vehicle has yet to enter the tunnel. I've already contacted Shang Min. She admits that she's been affected by the battlefield, and that the vehicle is faulty. I suggest that our squad go forward to provide support. Lieutenant Go, you guys send a maintenance soldier to move with us. Enter the front lines of the battlefield, if necessary. Go Yi was silent for half a second before saying, okay. Luo Nan and Liang Lu, who didn't have the right to speak on the installation point, looked at each other. Luo Nan was fine, but Liang Lu's breathing was a bit rushed. The color of his emotions was probably a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Sending a maintenance soldier. From the looks of it, there was a high probability that one of the two would be chosen. And this mission was fundamentally different from any other maintenance or patrol mission from before. Only, Liang Lu's state of mind was still in a tumultuous upheaval. Xianzhu had already called out names a step ahead of the two superiors. Luonan can go. He's an installation personnel. He has a plan in mind and he's pretty good at playing with the syncopator. Go over early to make some adjustments. This will save time. Liang Lu was stunned. He didn't even know if he was disappointed or relaxed when Go Yi approved of it. Luonan can go. It was still Xianzhu. He immediately said, Luonan can go, but he needs to swear a deadly oath first. Don't suddenly have a brain spasm and slice at the wildfire on the side of the road. Luonan could roughly understand that this was Xianzhu's type of exhortation and warning, but he didn't know how to respond for a time. As the superior, Go Yi didn't pay attention to Xianzhu's words. After a breath's worth of time passed, Go Yi suddenly spoke out of the blue. The news just came. Heiner is gone. Zoom isn't doing too well either. Xianzhu didn't say anything, but Liang Lu, who was next to Luonan, said, Petty Officer Heiner. Luonan had a bit of an impression. Heiner and Zoom were both members of the full maintenance unit. They were also veteran maintenance officers. They had been dispatched to the front lines to do wartime maintenance early on. Luonan had never met them before. It wasn't to the extent of being sad. But these two familiar yet unfamiliar names suddenly weaved together into an ominous tune. It was more realistic than any warning on the eve of a mission. Only the sound of the voice could be heard in the channel, but no one could be seen. Go Ye's tone was flat and he brushed this off. He only said to Yen Xian, we're already on our side. Literature building. Chapter 927. From beginning to end, the two officers didn't seek Luonan's opinion. Luonan was a soldier who had to obey orders at this time, even if he was a rookie recruit. Luonan didn't raise any opinions. He couldn't even confirm whether or not this was another mission arranged by the Inner Universe Simulator's primal chaos mechanism. Aside from Liang Lu beside him, there was no one else to send him off. In reality, Liang Lu's mood was at a low ebb right now. It was probably a psychological battle between being chosen and not chosen, between trust and danger. Luonan didn't investigate in detail. A new trial had arrived. He needed to adjust the state of his body and mind. Unfortunately, his state wasn't particularly good. You need to be cautious and you need to be obedient. Liang Lu pulled himself together with great difficulty. He used the most precise words he could to impart his not-so-rich experience. Of course you need to be confident. The lieutenant and the sergeant both chose you. This proves that you're the most suitable. The syncopator must be used according to the drill manual. Luonan nodded silently. He flexed and extended his fingers, slowly adjusting his breathing. It was also at this stage that a message popped up in the virtual vision of his left eye. He was pulled into a group channel called Mobile Squad 9. That Lieutenant Yen Xian was also in it, and he immediately gave him instructions. In 3 seconds we'll meet up with you at Weiji 06 launch exit number 2. From now until we depart, you have 6 seconds to adjust the group array to the standard sub-3 type. This will realize the docking of the squad. If you can't do it, speak up as soon as possible and switch people. Even for Luonan, Heaven Abyss's second unit had to be multiplied by 5 in order to conform to his perception of time. But when he heard the restriction of 3, 6 and the like, it made him feel pressure from the bottom of his heart. Luckily, Luonan was at launch exit number 2 right now. He didn't care about anything else. He closed his eyes and the auxiliary AI brought up the standard sub-3 type group array that Lieutenant Yen Xian spoke of. Actually, this was a secondary variant of the standard battle array. It existed as a special tactical branch in a large-scale war. This was also the special characteristic of the Heaven Abyss Empire's military. The dynamo core was the driving force, and the overall framework of the combat force was designed. This was the foundation of all tactics and strategies. All other combat equipment existed as extensions and mounting modules of this framework. Luonan was already in the most universal standard array, together with a large collective of over 70 people. The formation of the blocking position and some of the nodes of the spacetime barrier in the damaged GH-077 infrastructure module had achieved basic integration and interaction. It was as if rivers, sand, fish and shrimp had converged into a large lake with a relatively complete ecology. What he needed to do now was to temporarily draw a tributary, with a clear direction in the middle of the vague big lake, and make a detour outside. He closed his eyes and followed the description in the military drill manual. His body, spirit, chi and the external vertical collar dynamo core fully interacted, entering a stable and relatively lively state. The group channel of Mobile Squad 9 opened up its exclusive array interface to Luonan. Luonan imagined himself to be a lump of plasticine that was stuffed into the opening of a door lock. He combined it with the configuration design of the standard Sub-3 to carry out the fine-tuning of the adaptability. A low cry rang out, accompanied by whistling air currents and Lianglu's curses. Luonan opened his eyes and saw a light vehicle similar to a jeep sweep past his nose. It immediately came to a stop. Aside from the driver, there were 3 other people sitting on the vehicle. 2 on the left and 1 on the right. The empty seat was clearly for him. There was another vehicle of the same type a bit further behind. There were only 3 people including the driver. There were also 3 individual heavy armors that were over 5 meters tall. The entire group of 10 was already present. Luonan didn't know who Lieutenant Yen Xian was. Luonan didn't ask. He didn't say much either. He glanced at Lianglu once more before stepping over to sit in that seat. Everyone in the vehicle was already fully armed right now. The exoskeleton metal visor covered their line of sight and expressions. They all looked ice cold. Whether it was here or in the group channel, they didn't have any intention of communicating. This really wasn't too friendly. Luonan had a direct feeling of being rejected. But he was more familiar with the plane of configuration. It was like the head of a hammer smashing down the last segment the moment he stepped onto the light vehicle. There was a slight clicking sound, and the vehicle had already completed its transformation into the standard Sub-3 type group formation. It connected with the few people on the vehicle and the soldiers behind them who were similarly maintaining silence. It was a seamless fit. Luonan didn't look at the time. In any case, he was certain that he hadn't run out of time. He just puffed out his chest and said, "Maintenance Soldier Luonan reporting for duty." Lianglu clenched his fist to show his appreciation from below the vehicle. The person sitting across from Luonan finally spoke with a droning voice. "That's enough. Let's go." Clearly. He was Yen Xian, the commander of Luonan's current platoon. The vehicle and the heavy armor started up once more according to the order. They ascended to exit number 2 in succession and were launched out through a special opening and closing passageway. Luonan didn't have the time to buffer himself before he arrived in the true outside. He was driving through a long and narrow tunnel that was like a valley. The frontline battlefield was 300 meters away. Luonan didn't know whether or not he should be nervous right now. Lieutenant Yen Xian across from him spoke to him through the group channel without the slightest concealment. "You're a temporary member. We don't have any hopes, nor do we have the extravagant hope of having any tacit understanding. It's fine as long as we ensure that our respective missions are completed. What you need to do is to allow the transport vehicle to maintain the foundation of power to reach the blocking position. You also need to ensure that no accidents occur with the equipment during the entire transfer of the freezing device. As for your safety, we are responsible for it. You are ranked 3rd behind the freezing target and Lieutenant Shang Min, who is responsible for maintaining the freezing device. You can maintain contact through the group channel and receive technical guidance from Lieutenant Go Yi and the others. However, you must unconditionally obey the command sequence and arrangements of this platoon when it comes to the specific execution of tactics." Luonan didn't have much to say. He just nodded in agreement. Truthfully speaking, it didn't matter who it was ever since he entered the game setting. Whenever someone spoke to him for the first time, they would always talk about his identity as a recruit, even if they didn't have any evil intentions. Yen Xian's style of discussing matters as they were and doing things according to the official procedures really did give him a good impression. He swept his eyes over the group channel and saw the clear indication of the command sequence number. The general meaning of this was, Yen Xian had an assistant when he died. If the assistant died, there would be a 3rd, 4th, 5th, and so on. Of course, there was an even stricter long-range command system above this. The current superior commander of this platoon was Lieutenant Colonel Meng Fan of the blocking position. But there would likely be new changes once they entered the frontline battlefield. Luonan's thoughts spun as the transport vehicle had already charged nearly 100 meters forward. Its speed was far too fast, so much so that the warning sound was a notch behind. Entering the abnormal rule area, Luonan discovered that the light that entered his eyes became exceptionally dazzling even through the metal visor. The light flickered indefinitely, causing him to feel a bit impatient. The Literature Building. Chapter 928. The Remnants of the Domain Laws of the Hellfire Tyrant. Luonan was not shocked. Instead, he was happy. Luonan wasn't particularly familiar with things like rules and domains, but he wasn't unfamiliar with them either. He was at the level of, I know, I've experienced it, I have a general understanding of it, but I'm unable to give a lecture. If fighting with extraordinaries and wandering through the misty labyrinth could be considered as experiences on Earth. Regardless, Luonan was very interested in these things. He knew that grasping the domain laws and skillfully using them was the threshold he needed to cross in order to raise the level of his configuration ability to the next level. What's more, the stimulation these things gave him was so obvious in the game scene. Moreover, it wasn't just stimulation for Luonan himself. When Luonan and the members of Mobile Squad 9 quickly passed through this fiery zone, the flow of energy within the unified configuration frame formed by the Labyrinth Division formation was clearly affected by the dazzling light and the corresponding high temperature. Under the automatic adjustment of the Dynamo Core unit, the squad members, the equipped exoskeletons, the vehicles, and the heavy assault armor all made corresponding micro-adjustments. The machinery bore more pressure, consumed more energy, and weakened the powerful heat radiation of the outside world. At the same time, the relevant personnel needed to ensure the work efficiency of the internalized or mounted Dynamo Core. They had to cooperate in the frame state of their body and soul. This was only on the material plane. What Luonan saw on the configuration plane was much more complicated, but it was also much more straightforward. Luonan suppressed the urge to chop it. He used a method that was not out of line to observe seriously. But the problem was that the order was just that. On the level of details, no matter how seriously he looked or how much effort he put in, he could not see it particularly clearly. Luonan had guessed that it might be due to the limitations of his mental sensing mode when he was far away. But right now he was riding a light vehicle that simply ran over the fiery zone. The standard battle formation was in direct conflict with the remnant laws of the Hellfire Tyrant. What he could see was still limited. This was by no means the interference of the dazzling light. What truly troubled him was the feeling of fuzziness after the dazzling light. It was like a mosaic patch caused by the low resolution. In short, the picture was blurred. What was going on? Was it the natural influence of the domain laws of the Hellfire Tyrant? Or was it the limitation of his observation ability? Or was it a problem with the inner universe simulator? Luonan had faintly captured a link that he had overlooked before, but he didn't have the time to do further analysis before the 300-meter canyon formed on the GH-077 infrastructure module flashed past. Just when Luonan believed that his squad would directly charge out of the fissure tunnel, the light vehicle suddenly came to a stop. At the same time, Lieutenant Yen Xian issued a tactical order in the squad channel. All the personnel on the light vehicle got off the vehicle. They surrounded the two heavy assault armors and carried out a new deployment. At this moment, the information in the group channel increased rapidly, but it was not chaotic. Luonan was currently the highest level of protected personnel. He didn't have any additional missions. The others all received specific instructions in the group channel and dispersed to carry them out one after another. Luonan. Luonan looked around and looked. Nan's Luo. Luonan was free for a time. He turned his head to look in all directions, sizing up the surrounding environment. He was a bit surprised. This was because the scene didn't suddenly become clear and bright after he arrived at the end of the fissure tunnel. Instead, the interior of the tunnel maintained a certain continuity. The end of the flaming canyon could not be seen in front of him. However, the material was no longer the special material piled up from the corpses of the plate-building insect. Instead, it was the natural rock stratum of Vanguard Planet Number 4. Right now, the ground Luonan was standing on was still part of the Bio-077 infrastructure module. The temperature was quite high, but it was still within a controllable range. However, the influence of the defense configuration of the base's spacetime barrier began to weaken by a large margin. The dazzling flames of the Hellfire Tyrant wreaked more and more havoc. Not only was his line of sight severely obstructed, the ground and the rock stratum on both sides seemed to be warping and melting under the high temperature. There were even some magma-like viscous streams of fire flowing through the cracks in the precipitous walls. At first glance it looked a bit like the Blood Soul Temple. Correspondingly, explosions, blasts, air waves, fragments and other battlefield elements had already begun to reveal a greater sense of existence. From time to time, there would be flying devices and flying alien life forms sweeping across the sky above the canyon. Of course, there were large amounts of burning earth and rock that continued to collapse from the flaming canyon. It made one suspect that if they continued forward, they would be buried alive without the need for the enemy to make a move. However, Luonan was still able to see the soldiers of Mobile Squad 9 advance into the endlessly collapsing depths of the flaming canyon without the slightest hesitation after receiving orders, even though they were only in exoskeleton light armor. They carried out tactical vigilance and exploration. The soldiers who charged forward did indeed have the support of the standard array. A thin layer of light film appeared on their bodies under the roasting of the dazzling flames, giving them protection. But soon the figures of these people were engulfed by the flames. Even though the various data representing their states were still normal in the group channel, the visual effect was enough to make one tremble with fear. According to Luonan's rough judgment, the lethality of these dazzling flames was roughly equivalent to that of the mushed-mouth ape. Their forms were quite similar as well. They attacked the material and mental planes at the same time. Their current explosiveness was a bit lacking, but they far surpassed in terms of endurance and penetrative nature. In other words, these were all B+ rank lethality by Earth's standards. But the soldiers who charged forward, all the members of Mobile Squad 9 were at the sergeant rank. They went in when they said they would, without the slightest hesitation. Most importantly, they had indeed realized the ability to survive and maneuver in this extremely vile environment. As for their cultivations, it was really hard to estimate using Earth standards. According to Luonan's estimations, the individual combat strength of the relay station's officers and soldiers was compared to Earth's. Ignoring the special circumstances of the mental side and the special characteristics of some soldier types, the sergeant rank was already in between the awakened and the architect rank. In other words, it was on the level between C and B rank. If one were to include the bonus equipment, then they would probably have a B rank fleshly body. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to compare them to the upgraded versions of the Deep Blue Walkers of Quantum Corporation and the Apocalypse Laboratory. Their individual combat strength was already at the level of the architect rank. It was just the difference between B and B+. There were also a few examples. For example, Lu Andy, who was a veteran of 100 battles. Luonan found it hard to estimate what kind of combat strength he could display after being equipped with equipment. As for the illustrious nobles, it was said that there would be a bit of a difference in rank and strength, but it wasn't too much of a problem to view them as extraordinary. In this way, there were over 10,000 people in the relay station's defense force. 1 out of 10 sergeants, 1 out of 100 lieutenants and 12 illustrious nobles. Aside from the fact that the number of extraordinaries was a bit lacking, this single unit was enough to completely crush Earth's side in other aspects. But Luonan still had to say that this wasn't the way to look at strength. Purely comparing individual combat strength was completely meaningless. What about weapons and equipment that were countless generations apart? What about the systematization of cultivation? What about the most direct, standard arrays that could be formed by 2 people, 3 to 5 people, 10 to 100 people, and even 1,000 to 10,000 people? Luonan had crossed paths with Deep Blue Walkers many times on the plane of reality. He had always been researching burners, the archetype format, the Deep Blue platform, the Apocalypse Laboratory, and other targets. He was fully aware that a single Deep Blue Walker wasn't scary, but a group of 8 or 10 Deep Blue Walkers working together to open up a formatted space absolutely couldn't be underestimated. But compared to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's standard array, the coordinated attack system was much more powerful than the Heavenly Yuan Empire's standard array. Apart from the fact that it was much more powerful on the mental level, there were also differences in every aspect and every detail. The most important point was that even though the number of burners on Earth had rapidly expanded during this period of time, there were at most 1 or 2,000 of them. There were even fewer who could reach the evaluation of B rank. But there were practically no exceptions among the thousands of sergeants at the relay station, at least in the battle order. Their combat strength was indeed powerful to the point of inconceivably powerful. But on this basis, what level was the combat strength of the great sovereign-level fantasy breed and his servant army that formed an all-out siege against the relay station? Needless to say, on an even broader plane, in the endless era of movement that spanned hundreds and thousands of years, super-powerful beings like Lord Jianghu, great sovereign Chang'e Xuan, and the gods of the heavens simply exceeded the scope of his rational imagination and construction. Luonan stood at the edge of the fissure tunnel at this moment. He faced the dazzling light and raging flames that assaulted his face. The standards of extraordinary power that he had gradually established on Earth began to melt and collapse. At the same time, a tender sprout of curiosity and thirst for knowledge was frantically absorbing nutrients within the shattered ruins. It grew rapidly, so much so that some of his thoughts, which had gradually subdued in the collective environment of strict military rules, began to stir once more. They popped. And it was at this time that Lieutenant Yen Xian suddenly called out to him. "Luo Nan." "Yes, Lieutenant." Luo Nan thought that the operation was about to begin, but he didn't know that he had pulled Yen Xian into an impromptu chat group. Go Yi and Xian Zhu, who acted as technical instructors, were already here. There were also two other people. One was Lieutenant Shang Min, whom Luo Nan had just heard of, and the other was called Damo Luan. He was also a lieutenant. Luo Nan was the smallest of them all. But no one paid attention to these details right now. The chat group interface was spread out with a simple diagram of the current situation on the battlefield outside. It was extremely intuitive. From Luo Nan's point of view, it was like he was facing a chessboard. His perspective cut in from the parallel direction of the Chu River Han boundary. The two flanks were the battlefield of intense strangulation. The green dot of light that marked the transport vehicle could barely be considered to be the left edge of the Chu River Han boundary. It roughly crossed the position of the Zhu Lin boundary and advanced with difficulty. There were still at least 2 squares of distance before Luo Nan and the others could successfully jump out of the chessboard. Chapter 929. Luo Nan saw the map of the battlefield situation, but this didn't mean that he had to. Or that he had the qualifications to think about this. The officers who had entered the conversation group long before him had more or less analyzed the situation. What Luo Nan needed to do next was just carry out the orders. Oh, due to the special nature of technical work, he needed to do some homework in advance. He needed to make some basic judgments. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't even have the chance to enter the conversation group. The Heavenly Yuan Empire was known as an empire. Under most circumstances, the hierarchy was very strict. Luckily, Go Yi, who had recommended Luo Nan to participate in this operation, took great care of him. This is the transport vehicle's structural diagram, the mounting module diagram, and the design diagram of the freezing device. Both the configuration and the machinery are present. Also, this is the current real-time self-inspection status of the transport vehicle. There is also the list of spare parts and maintenance plans that Officer Xian Zhu and I have determined based on the above information. A portion of this has already been carried over by Mobile Squad 9. The rest will be delivered by the Battlefield Supply Department at a fixed point after confirmation. Luo Nan instantly received a large amount of information. He also received Lieutenant Go Ye's complex and meticulous train of thought on this matter. He was quite embarrassed by this. Compared to a veteran maintenance soldier like Go Yi, Luo Nan's train of thought was a bit too straightforward. He had come over with his head down, completely neglecting the spare parts and maintenance plans. Even if he reached the transport vehicle, would he have to use his teeth to fix it? Xianzhu also spoke. Basically, you can follow this. But you need to pay attention to the basics. In this damned place, unforeseen events can happen in the blink of an eye. Plus, some people have chosen a tactical route. Basically, they are aiming for the unexpected. Shut your mouth. We've already delayed for a quarter of an hour. Even if we delay for 10 more seconds, the entire operation will be pointless. Lieutenant Damo, who Luo Nan had never dealt with before, sounded extremely irritable. Luo Nan was even able to hear some explosive noises from deep within. Could it be that this Mr. Lieutenant was still in the middle of battle? Luo Nan couldn't get angry at such a person. Soon, a slightly raspy female voice rang out. Damo, your opinion and attitude have already been made clear. You won't change it. Then concentrate on doing what you need to do. The flank has taken another hit. Dizzy. The short words had yet to finish when the chat interface already displayed the words, Shang Min has kicked Damo out of the conversation group. This big sister lieutenant was really straightforward. Luo Nan couldn't help but think of Go Yi and Xian Zhu's trust towards this female officer. They even felt fear. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the voice again. Now the inner magnetic coil on the left side of the car body is broken, and the energy storage tank is giving an alarm. What should we do? Go Yi immediately said, you only need to. I'm asking the maintenance soldier who's about to board the train. Only now did Luo Nan realize that this big sister lieutenant officer was coming straight for him. But what could he do even if he knew? He had never come into contact with transfer vehicles before, and he had only obtained the relevant blueprints and information for a few seconds. How could he come up with a plan? Speaking of which, how many days had it been since Luonan was asked to the point of being tongue-tied when it came to professional knowledge? It was precisely because of this experience that he was about to forget that he became more and more useless. His face flushed red and even felt a little hot. Officer Xiang Min's tone was a bit cold when she asked Luonan a question. Perhaps those two cripples sent you because they had more thorough considerations. But I believe that before you board the bus, the most important thing you should do is, all I have to do is make up for it. Holy crap. Luonan immediately thought of Officer Damo's fate. How could he not know what he was facing? In this instant he wasn't thinking about begging for mercy or a reprieve. Instead, he was thinking about something that was especially important to him. It should have existed alongside the battlefield situation diagram, but it wasn't reflected in the diagram. Luonan's voice moved and something popped out in his mind. I want the real-time route of the transfer vehicle and the monitoring diagram of the surrounding spatial barrier configuration. Only the heavens knew whether or not the words he had hastily organized could be conveyed properly. In any case, Luonan had already been kicked out of the conversation before his voice faded away. The simplified map of the battlefield that he had seen in the dialogue earlier had also been wiped clean. Luonan let out a low cry, but it was useless. Officer Yen Xian turned his head at this time. The eyes beneath the metal helmet seemed to be observing him. Luonan pondered whether or not he should let this officer help pass on a message. But at this time, the Chu River Han boundary appeared in the virtual interface of Luonan's left eye in the form of a chessboard. The complex and changing graphical lines and numeric symbols appeared at the same time as well. Luonan would have been stupefied in the past, but after listening to Lieutenant Commander Xingzhan's lecture earlier, he already had some ability to adapt to this kind of expression. He knew that this was the real-time monitoring data of the defense state of the base's internal and external areas by Ant Kuei, the highest-level AI of the relay station. Those who knew the ropes would naturally be able to obtain the necessary information. Luonan could barely be considered as someone who knew the ropes. Aside from this, there were even more intuitive markings on the chessboard. Two dotted lines extended out from the green dots that represented the transport vehicle. One was to advance along the edge of the Chu River Han boundary, and at the very end of the chessboard, he would enter the canyon area in the center. The other was to directly enter the canyon from where the grid was, and then go straight to the blocking position from the center. Seeing these two lines, Luonan immediately understood what the officers were discussing and debating about in the impromptu chat group. Of course, he also knew what the final result would be. Sure enough, the conservative route that extended along the edge of the canyon had already been erased in the time it took to breathe. All that was left was the route that forced its way through the depths of the canyon. Luonan naturally discarded the data of the useless region. He focused on observing the situation of the space-time barrier in the canyon region in front of him. The chaotic and changing graphical lines gave him a sense of intuition. The rapidly switching numbers were even more callous. Luonan wasn't sensitive enough to the latter, but he already knew that this path was absolutely not easy to walk just by looking at the former. He didn't know or care about the other dangers. What gave him the biggest headache was how to deal with the intense conflict between the space-time barrier and the laws of the Hellfire Tyrant's domain. The structural strength of the transport vehicle was a challenge. The maintenance of the transport vehicle's transportation environment was another. Luonan quickly flipped through the blueprints, doing his utmost to absorb the key points of knowledge within. His cerebral cortex faintly swelled and cracked. Right when he was racking his brains, Lieutenant Yen spoke in a deep voice. "What's your opinion?" Luonan was startled, but he knew that he didn't have the time to hesitate. He immediately gritted his teeth and answered, "I need to do an on-the-spot survey and adapt." This definitely wasn't a good answer, but Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't have any other reaction. He just said, "Then let's go. The light vehicles in front are unable to pass. You activate the follow mode and pin down Jianghu. I'll be behind you." Jianghu was a member of Mech Class 9. Luonan was one of the pilots of the heavy assault armor. He glanced to the left, looking at the steel behemoth that was 3 times his height and 50 times his weight. Luonan had already activated the relevant interface on the Dynamo Core program. Naturally, Luonan had no reason to refuse. "You don't need to think too much for now. Concentrate on studying the data. You need to display your usefulness in the transport vehicle." Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't say what would happen if Luonan didn't display his usefulness. Luonan didn't want to know. The auxiliary AI vibrated once more. It was Lieutenant Go Yi who sent more data. It was an extremely considerate solution to the problem of magnetic coils and energy storage tanks. Xianzhu's message followed closely behind. Don't worry. There are quite a few field maintenance soldiers over there. We aren't crazy enough to let you shoulder the burden alone. Luonan's eyelids twitched. Even though Xianzhu said these things to reduce the pressure on him, Luonan acted as if he hadn't seen these words. Lieutenant Yen Xian didn't tarry any longer. After receiving the latest information from the scouting outpost, he issued an order in the squad channel. The entire squad advanced forward. A total of 11 people, including Luonan, completely submerged into the ceaselessly burning and collapsing rock canyon before them in less than half a second. Luonan left the basic construction module and stepped onto the natural rock layer of the planet. The ever-bright virtual interface on Luonan's left retina clearly dimmed by a layer. Part of it was due to the effect of the intense light, but the majority of it was due to the interference of the shattered domain laws of the Hellfire Tyrant behind the dazzling flames. This complicated and shattered law was so close to Luonan. If it weren't for the isolation of the exoskeleton armor and the Type S3 array, Luonan might have already melted inside. But even at this distance, the details of the flames were still blurred like a mosaic. How strange. Who cares? Luonan narrowed his eyes. He used his eyelids to isolate the piercing flames, maintaining the purity of his thoughts. At this moment, even the mysteries of the Hellfire Tyrant's domain laws had to make way for the mission he shouldered. Sergeant Jie Gang drove his heavy assault armor up ahead, directly smashing through the wall of fire and the ceaselessly falling earth and rock fragments. He forcefully opened up a path forward in the depths of the already half-collapsed canyon. At the same time he pulled Luonan along, maintaining relative synchronization. Lieutenant Yen Xian was endlessly adjusting the weight of each member of the squad receiving the array's blessing. No matter how he adjusted it, Luonan would always be the one with the highest priority. So much so that Luonan's vision was completely blocked several hundred meters ahead. There were no other changes to Luonan's body aside from the floating dust and the elevated temperature caused by the scorching flames. Under these conditions, Luonan endlessly integrated the design blueprints, the transfer vehicle's real-time self-inspection results, the surrounding environment. Of course, there were also the nesting and functional relationships of the space-time barrier, the standard combat array, and other large and small configuration systems. He knew that time was of the essence. He simply gave up on the material and mechanical parts and only focused on one. Because of this, the knowledge and information he grasped didn't have a standard to refer to. All he had was the general network of thought that was established on the foundation of configuration, as well as his mind that gradually stabilized. Suddenly, an order pierced into the group channel and Luonan's auxiliary AI mission system at the same time. It included the corresponding authority and signal link. And the most core sentence was, "Get in the car." Chapter 930. Did the transfer vehicle come down just like that? Just looking at the momentum of the landslide above their heads, it was as if they were all buried alive. Should he charge in under these circumstances? In the end, Luonan was not an elite who had experienced hundreds of battles on the battlefield. He instinctively analyzed the situation when he saw the collision of flint and stone and the momentum of the landslide pouring down. The problem was that he was currently in the middle of the platoon. It was simply not his turn to make a judgment. He did not move. The heavy assault armor in front of him was pulling him to move. Behind him, Lieutenant Yen Xian was forcing him to move. There was no need to shout to urge him. The configuration change of the platoon array was the clearest command. Luonan did not resist. He made the choice that was most in line with battlefield discipline at this time. He completed a series of adjustments with the standard movements of a drill. His entire body was like an arrow shot by an incorporeal bowstring. He followed behind the heavy assault armor and charged into the flood of flames and rubble. In this moment, Luonan faintly found the feeling he had when he fought with Gong Qi some time ago. Especially the blazing high temperature that distorted the surrounding air and even the form of all matter. It was extremely similar to the lava cavern that was the final battlefield back then. But the current situation was not the same as back then, when he had the Pearl of Wisdom in his hands. It was far too chaotic. The whistling flood of rubble wrapped in raging flames, continuously battered down. It was like the continuous beating of a large drum by his side. The shock waves stirred his internal organs, rocking them back and forth. This proved that the defensive power of the platoon battle array was still in play. The heavy assault armor that opened up the path also tore through the most destructive force of the landslide's frontal assault. This gave Luonan the space to adjust his strength. As for the transfer vehicle that looked as if it wanted to smash all the receiving personnel to death, its enormous body, which was like a heavy truck, clearly had a reverse brake in the middle of its descent. The damage to one side of the maglev device caused the vehicle to lose balance. The rear end smashed heavily into the rock wall of the canyon, forming an even more astonishing landslide of rubble. However, it was not enough to fall straight down and lead to a tragedy of suicide. Luo Nan did not need to be reminded to know that the time had come when the transfer vehicle did its best to adjust its position in midair. But Luo Nan didn't need to put much effort into it. The virtual vision of his left eye already displayed a simulated route leading to the objective of this operation. It even marked out the specific methods and nodes of exertion. All Luo Nan needed to do was precisely execute. Actually, even if he made a mistake in his execution, Lieutenant Yen Xian, who had been following him like a shadow, would certainly be his final insurance. Luo Nan was able to clearly sense that Lieutenant Yen Xian had already chased him to a distance that was within arm's reach. Luo Nan could exert his strength from behind at any time. Rookies really don't make people feel at ease. The corner of Luo Nan's mouth cracked open behind the metal visor. His state of mind became increasingly clear. He began to silently count in his mind, using the rhythm of the Earth's countdown. 2, 1. Dodge. Yen Xian, who was behind Luo Nan, suddenly changed his orders. Luo Nan, who had already begun to twist his waist to exert strength, was forcefully knocked down by the steel body charging at him from behind. And the already tall and sturdy torso of the heavy assault armor in front of Luo Nan swelled up several times in this instant. Its two arms came together with a bang, and its mechanical modules deformed to prop up a large shield of considerable surface area. It protected Luo Nan, Yen Xian, and the other two squad sergeants who had alertly pounced back. Luo Nan plunged headfirst into the loose yet still burning layer of rubble. He couldn't see anything, but he still maintained a connection with the transfer vehicle. So he was able to clearly sense that the transfer vehicle, which had been about to finish adjusting itself, suddenly suffered an extremely powerful artillery strike from the rear. The penetrative power and explosive power of this strike were tyrannical to the extreme. Nearly a fifth of the metal outer shell, baffles, and spare parts of the rear of the transfer vehicle were blown into smithereens. At the same time, there were at least 3 human bodies, or broken limbs and fragments. The transfer vehicle lost control in an instant. The real-time information Luo Nan received clearly showed that the vehicle's kinetic system was in disorder. The forceful braking had reduced the momentum of the vehicle's fall, but it suddenly increased explosively. The vehicle plunged down diagonally from midair, smashing into the rock layer at the other side of the canyon. The body of the heavy truck, with the momentum of the fall, dug almost 3 meters deep into the wall, but it was also crazily straightening itself. Pushed by the uncontrollable power, it was like a blunt knife that cut an extremely deep crack in the burning wall. Then it pushed against half of the rock stratum and moved forward with a loud bang. Its direction was still toward the blocking position, but this way, it perfectly missed Luo Nan and the others who were coming over to provide support. Luo Nan subconsciously wanted to get up when he saw the situation, but Yen Xian, who was pressing down on his shoulder, didn't say a word. He gave Luo Nan a clear downward force, stopping Luo Nan's movements. In the next instant, Luo Nan saw through the monitoring equipment of the transfer vehicle that smoke rose from all over the canyon. Some abnormal colors were cast down from above. The color was a relatively dark yellowish-green ball of mucus. It caught fire the moment it came into contact with fire. Smoke rose everywhere, and it rapidly accumulated to a certain density before exploding with a rumble. The dazzling flames that were burning on the rock layer exploded into a rain of fire that filled the sky. This rain of fire would burn and corrode a hole in the blink of an eye as soon as it landed on something solid. Moreover, there was a second explosion. It was extremely sinister. Luo Nan's side was able to evade in time. He had the heavy assault armor blocking the outermost layer. The defensive power of the array was effectively concentrated, allowing him to avoid this disaster. It was just that the surface of the armor controlled by Jie Gang had suffered quite a bit of damage. But on the other side, the transport vehicle had already suffered heavy damage. Its defensive power was clearly lacking. After this rain of fire, it became riddled with thousands of holes. The sinister flames that had been catalyzed were impossible to extinguish as long as they burned. The flames followed along the outer armor of the vehicle body, continuing to spread and permeate. In the short span of a breath, the transport vehicle had truly become a train. It was like a raging burning ball of fire. It launched a desperate charge toward the fissured tunnel several hundred meters away. "Let's go," This time, Yin Xian forcefully pulled Luo Nan up. Then he exploded into action, reversing his direction. He charged like a hurricane on this side of the canyon in an attempt to catch up to the transport vehicle, which was wrapped in flames. Luo Nan used his own perspective to quickly survey the surroundings. He saw a series of muffled collisions. It was similar to the cannon fire that had fiercely struck the transport vehicle before. The collisions smashed into the two sides of the rock walls. Every collision caused smoke and dust to fill the sky. Shock waves crisscrossed back and forth, pounding people's lungs and causing their skulls to shake. Shadows streaked across the air above the canyon. There were at least a dozen or so low-flying vehicles and even more pterodactyl-like vicious creatures. They whistled and pierced through the air in a form of collision. Quite a few of them turned into fireballs in the first instant. Armored soldiers jumped out of the vehicles and fell to the edge of the canyon. Some even fell to the bottom of the canyon. As for the pterodactyls, they were the main culprits that had spat out the acid bombs. They suffered quite a bit of damage right now. Fortunately, they weren't able to drop a second wave of catalyzing poison that could have taken their lives. There was also an enormous beetle that was the size of a heavy tank at the edge of the canyon. It was unknown when it had surged up, but it fell down like dumplings. Its enormous size was simply a devastating disaster for the already fragile canyon. It gave people the feeling that hundreds of thousands of square meters of earth and rock had collapsed in the blink of an eye. Luo Nan had seen the acid pterodactyls, the assault beetles, and the monsters that carried out the long-range bombardment during his offline testing. He had been in the game for a long time, and he understood that these were the servants of the magnetite mica jellyfish. They were terrifying monsters that were created under the dual effects of magnetization and stitching. There was also the Hellfire Tyrant that was still in a corner of the battlefield. It was extremely likely that this was the result of the third and most mysterious ability of the magnetite mica jellyfish, the Dimensional Gate. This was the might of a senior monarch-level magnetite mica jellyfish. He was thinking too far ahead. But these things before his eyes were undoubtedly attracted by the transport vehicle. The intensity of their battle had already exceeded the norm. Even with Luo Nan's relatively meager knowledge, he was able to determine that this represented the tyrannical senior monarch-level life form that occupied the clouds. It was currently casting its attention in this direction. There was no doubt that the base was mobilizing troops as well. But the space-time fortress was damaged, and the front lines were in a state of chaos. The response was inevitably a beat slower. Right now, the natural rock layer region of the Blazing Canyon was close to the Bio 077 module. It was on the verge of collapse. Not only were the flames of the canyon not extinguished under the surging flood of earth and rock, but they exploded once more. Though they didn't turn into a rain of fire, the impact force was still extremely tyrannical. Luo Nan, who had already turned back at high speed, felt high-temperature flames pounce on his back. His exoskeleton armor was about to melt. At this time metal clanged. The heavy assault armor that Jie Gang piloted was like a sturdy wall. It forcefully inserted itself between the gushing flames and the retreating Luo Nan and the others, isolating them from the high temperature and the shockwave. On the other side, the other heavy assault armor did the same. It protected the other light armor infantry of the squad, blocking at least a portion of the attack. In an instant. Then this temporarily formed defensive array was wrapped up by the dazzling flames and shockwave of the explosion. It was on the verge of collapse. And after the impact of the raging flames, an even more deadly and vicious enemy was about to attack. Luo Nan couldn't pay attention to the surging heat wave behind him. He just stared fixedly at the transport vehicle in front of him that was already beyond recognition. The maintenance plan that Go Yi and Xianzhu had prepared in advance had long since become a pile of meaningless symbols under these circumstances. Most of the information that Luo Nan had forcefully stuffed into his brain was about to be turned to ash along with the flames wrapping around the vehicle. Yen Xian was still leading Luo Nan in pursuit, but he didn't have any effective orders. It was easy to imagine that the impromptu conversation group he was in certainly didn't have any clear plans. In fact, under these circumstances, it was unknown whether or not the freezing device, which had harsh requirements for maintaining the environment, would still be working normally. No, it was still working. Luo Nan's breathing grew more and more hurried as he madly sprinted to his limits. At this moment, his brain was constantly refreshing the real-time monitoring data of the transport vehicle, even though it was becoming more and more incomplete, more and more blurry and chaotic. Speaking of which, this wasn't much from Luo Nan's perspective. He wasn't an expert when it came to the mechanical structure of the vehicle. His true domain of superiority lay in the level of configuration that was above the material substance. In Luo Nan's eyes, the core configuration of the current transport vehicle was extraordinarily complete. Perhaps this description needed to be extended to an even broader domain. Chapter 931. Luo Nan's consciousness grew all the more lively under this pressing situation. He tried to polish the judgment in his heart a bit more clearly to inform Yen Xian, Go Yi, and the other superiors. But before he could form words, the transfer vehicle in front of him, the transfer vehicle that Luo Nan had determined to have a complete core configuration, loudly disintegrated from the intense collision and friction that continued for several hundred meters. The transfer vehicle even formed a muffled explosion the instant it disintegrated. The bursting wave of air blew the fragmented body of the vehicle out from the rock wall it had cut into. The outer shell of the vehicle split into pieces, and the parts and fragments filled the sky. There were even human figures bursting out from within the vehicle. Luo Nan's eyelids twitched violently behind the metal visor. He also felt some fluctuations in the mind of Lieutenant Yen Xian beside him. The frequency at which Lieutenant Yen Xian's head swayed left and right clearly increased. It was clear that Lieutenant Yen Xian was intimidated by the situation before his eyes and was somewhat distracted. Of course Luo Nan was affected as well. The situation he saw with his own eyes and his deeper perceptual judgment formed a solid collision. But soon his brain won over his eyes. His mouth was a step ahead as he gasped for breath and hissed, "There's no problem with the freezing device." Lieutenant Yen Xian tilted his head to the side. Then he gave an unexpected answer, "Yes, there's no problem." Luo Nan's psychological analysis of Lieutenant Yen Xian was clearly wrong, but his most crucial judgment hit the bull's eye. After the aftermath of the explosion dissipated, the situation became increasingly clear. It was true that the transfer vehicle had exploded, but its core, the cabin that carried the freezing device, was still basically intact. At most it was a bit blackened by the smoke and fire. Instead, it seized the opportunity to break free from the insidious flames catalyzed by the pterosaur's acid bomb. It also broke free from the negative effects of the vehicle's completely out of control. It relied on its own miniature power pump to continue advancing towards the blocking position in a maglev state. Though its speed was 2 levels slower, it was much steadier than before. As for the human figures bursting out from the explosion, they had clearly taken the initiative to break free. 7 or 8 of them were either calm or in a sorry state, but they all landed safely on the ground. They just so happened to rendezvous with Mobile Squad 9, which had been pushed over by the surging heat wave. The battle formations of both sides instantly adjusted to their positions, harmonizing as one. And then, everyone continued running with large strides. There was nothing he could do about it. Even though the previous round of destructive collapses and explosions formed surging waves of heat that began to rapidly weaken with the passage of time and distance, ominous noises continued to enter Luo Nan's ears one after another. It was a kind of screeching sound of friction. It was the omen of a tyrannical assault beetle breaking through the smoke and flames to quickly approach. At this moment, the enemy's pterosaur forces in the air began to be suppressed by the superior firepower of the base. The distant artillery also temporarily stopped firing. However, these assault beetles that had broken through the layers of defense and were pressing forward were still troublesome and powerful enemies. Luo Nan had once specially researched the information on these toys. He knew that their bodies were enormous like light tanks. Every one of them was about the size of a heavy assault armor, and they possessed boundless strength. Their limbs were sharp, their speed was extremely fast, and their close combat might was astonishing. Perhaps its outer shell was a little weak, but once it was heavily injured, its entire body would burn on its own. Its explosive power and lethality would increase dramatically, allowing it to launch a deadly assault on its target. It could be said that once these guys got close, the members of Mobile Squad 9 who were equipped with light armor, and the escort personnel who jumped down from the transport vehicle, would at most end up exchanging a life for a life. Everyone knew how powerful these things were, so the best way to deal with them was to seize the opportunity when the enemy's air power was being suppressed at this stage. This was to create the most reasonable combat distance and tempo for long-range combat. However, a more realistic problem was quickly placed before them. In front, the frozen living cabin, which had shaken off the transport vehicle's outer shell, had already degraded its own power. Its speed had already dropped to around 50 kilometers per hour, and it was advancing less than 15 meters per second. And it was still nearly a kilometer away from the assault position. The group channel, which had been silent for a long time, finally refreshed with new orders. In this instant, the officers of Mobile Squad 9 practically flipped their bodies at the same time, forming a retreating, defending, and attacking formation. The escort personnel of the transport vehicle were just a bit late, but they also made corresponding changes. Aside from Luo Nan and Yen Xian, everyone else clearly slowed down in the span of a breath or two. As for those assault beetles, their entire bodies had already been set aflame just as they emerged from the dazzling flames. They entered a berserk state and their speed continued to soar. The distance between the two sides had been erased by more than half with one drop, and the ones at the very back had already begun to exchange fire with the enemy. Even though Luo Nan was a rookie on the battlefield, he knew that this absolutely wasn't the best tactical choice. Casualties appeared in practically the first instant. Luo Nan could only watch helplessly as a certain code name dimmed down in the group channel. Before he could react, another code name appeared. Strictly speaking, Luo Nan didn't know the people of Mobile Squad 9. They were separated by a visor when they met. Even if Luo Nan changed places and changed attire, Luo Nan wouldn't be able to recognize him. It was just that the innate emotional mechanism of humans displayed its effect at this moment. This change was like a whip that directly lashed at the top of Luo Nan's head, causing his entire cerebral cortex to twitch. "I'll go speed up," Luo Nan blurted out. "Protection is the #1 priority." Lieutenant Yen Xian's voice was so calm that it didn't seem like a real person's. Luo Nan didn't argue with him. It was also at this moment that the plan in his mind suddenly became clear. He began to output into the temporary channel connected to Go Yi and Xianzhu. He adjusted and selected the tools and spare parts he needed. The two officers had previously designated a large portion of the items. Luo Nan didn't request for additional items. He needed to save time. There were no arguments in the channel either. The two officers, who were also the seniors of the maintenance soldiers, chose to let the frontline maintenance soldiers follow their own train of thought at this critical moment. This was also to save time. Confirm. Fire. The spare parts Luo Nan requested were fired from the location of the assault array through guidance technology. They were thrown to the place they had to pass through in order to receive them. But what arrived first were 3 blazing flashes of light. They practically streaked across everyone's scalps. They exploded a few meters behind Luo Nan. To be more precise, they exploded in the line of fire formed by the assault personnel behind him. The assault position, fortress, was the artillery support. The number of assault beetles that were blown over was secondary. What was important was that it formed an even larger landslide. It completely blocked off the path to Flaming Canyon behind the line of fire. The offensive of the vicious assault beetles had suffered a setback. But it was only a setback. The magnetic mica jellyfish of the senior monarch level had certainly set Flaming Canyon as an extremely high priority. The servant army of the frontline battlefield poured in regardless of the cost. These stitched freaks, who had no concept of fear and death, displayed a crazy drive to blast open the defensive barrier of time and space. They used the explosions of their own kind as their main attack, and they used their sharp limbs to dig as support. In the blink of an eye and a breath of time, the collapsed canyon passage was forcefully pierced through by the swarm of assault beetles. This kind of investment seemed to be enough to carry out a few waves of assaults against the assault position ahead. In fact, the assault position had already entered a state of war. They had begun to execute the assault mission. Luo Nan divided a portion of his mind to pay attention to the battle situation, but his thoughts were not chaotic. Instead, his thoughts became clearer and clearer. The spare parts and toolboxes were already in place ahead. To the side, the outer cabin of the maglev propulsion frozen alive installation was already a short distance behind them. It was even easier to calculate ahead of time. He could faintly feel Lieutenant Yen Xian's gaze turn over. This was a critical juncture where he needed to make a move. If Luo Nan did not react in time, Yen Xian would do the same as before and make the decision for him. This time, there was really no need. Luo Nan exhaled and inhaled from behind his visor. He sent out a message in the group channel, "Prepare to dock." This time he did not count down. He directly exerted force after the preparatory work was completed. The exoskeleton armor that covered his entire body gave him an even greater restraint. Actually, the expansion and contraction of the muscles of his entire body formed an even more explosive force that propelled him to the side and forward. In the end, Luo Nan was not a true rookie recruit. Even though he had never experienced a battlefield like this, he had crossed swords with all sorts of people on Earth. This experience was enough to temper his judgment and action power at critical junctures. In this moment, the state of the outer cabin of the Frozen Alive installation, the state of the squad, the state of the spare parts box ahead, and his own state all appeared in his mind in a configuration mode that was detached from the substance. The configuration mode continuously refreshed and changed. Whether it was calculation, prediction, or intuition, there was nothing wrong with Luo Nan's ejection trajectory, and the forward path of the outer cabin of the Frozen Alive installation converged in an instant 20 meters ahead of him. It was at the midline of the canyon. And there was precisely the location of the spare parts box that had been launched over. Luo Nan took the first step and unlocked the privileges of the spare parts box through the air. He controlled this box made of special materials and placed it flat on the flame-covered ground. Luo Nan, who was suspended in midair, waited for a moment in this position. The belated outer cabin of the Frozen Alive installation passed through the top of the spare parts box and collided head-on. A muffled sound rang out as the spare parts box accurately adhered to the bottom of the outer cabin of the Frozen Alive installation. At the same time, a data link was realized. As for Luo Nan, he had already obtained the relevant privileges earlier. Right now, he displayed his usefulness. The outer cabin of the Frozen Alive installation, which was completely in the state of a lump of iron, opened a door in front of it. Luo Nan shrunk his body and rolled, smashing his body inside. Luo Nan's ears buzzed and vibrated in this moment. Then he collided with a layer of nothingness, an air buffer membrane. He spun a dozen times in this not-so-spacious area, and the powerful momentum was digested. It was just that Luo Nan couldn't control his body's balance too firmly for the sake of ensuring the relative stability of his brain and lungs. The air buffer membrane disappeared, and his shoulders and hips smashed onto the floor of the carriage with a bang. Luo Nan didn't have any other reactions aside from gasping for breath. At most, he took the opportunity to test the state of the spare parts box through the floor. Then he propped himself up and looked out the only side window. He saw Lieutenant Yen Xian's figure shoot back at high speed from outside. Clearly, he had already returned to the front lines of battle. Luo Nan's gaze turned back. It was unavoidable that his gaze was attracted by the translucent, Frozen Alive installation at the center of the cabin. The person inside that had entered a Frozen Alive state seemed familiar. Whether it was the tall and astonishing torso, or the malevolent metal prosthesis that blended with flesh and blood on its cheeks, it gave off an extremely deep impression. Luo Nan had seen this person 2 days ago. That's right. This was one of the high-ranking officers of the relay station, the commander of the elite mobility force, Sir Shi Yuan. Hold on. If this person was here, then who was the one resisting the Hellfire Tyrant on the front lines? Chapter 932. Luo Nan was slightly startled. A good problem appeared before his eyes. It was worth researching, but he didn't take it a step further. His energy really didn't allow him to. Instead of thinking about these things, he might as well take the opportunity to catch a few breaths and slow down his sluggish and weak state. Phew. Phew. What a freak. Luo Nan did his best to calm his breathing. He felt the repeated process of sweat overflowing his skin and being sucked dry by the combat uniform. His mouth mumbled some meaningless words. His state hadn't been good since he arrived at the battlefield today. He was tired, dizzy, irritated. His physical strength consumption had increased quite a bit compared to normal. Luo Nan guessed that it was either because he didn't have the experience of long-term service in the medium to large standard arrays, or because he didn't have enough skills in carrying heavy loads. Or maybe the chaotic rules and environment outside gave him, a sensitive outsider, too much interference. But in any case, physical strength was absolutely not an excuse for not doing a good job. He exerted himself to gasp for a few breaths. He half-knelt on the cabin board and used the preset control panel to remotely control the spare parts container that was only separated by a board. He inspected the modules and spare parts inside and made a preliminary classification in his mind. In a certain sense, the spare parts container was equivalent to a miniature munitions factory for a qualified maintenance soldier. Luo Nan, who had just started his career as a maintenance soldier, could still be considered a qualified maintenance soldier. There was still room for discussion. But his mind really did store a sizable design blueprint and a configuration framework with even more guiding significance. After a few hurried breaths, the inspection was completed and his train of thought became clear once more. Luo Nan began to knock on the cabin board. He had seen the structural diagram of the transport vehicle before. He knew that this cabin was originally in the middle of the vehicle. There was room for protection and buffer space in all 4 directions. Of course, there were also corresponding entrances and exits. He had to bring his tools up. Move forward another half an arm. You have 0.4 seconds. A hoarse female voice came from the shadowy area formed on the other side of the Freeze Alive device without warning. Luo Nan didn't find it strange at all. No matter how the vehicle disintegrated or how many guards jumped or were injured, Lieutenant Xiang Min, the only member of the medical sequence, would certainly be on the side of the freeze-alive device. Lieutenant Xiang Min was the one who unloaded Luo Nan's momentum when he crashed inside. It was just that Luo Nan and Xiang Min didn't have the leisure to do so. They didn't have the time to greet or chat. But now, when it came to maintaining the state of the freezing device, they had to communicate. Luo Nan also felt the need to explain a bit. I need 1 second. I need to take out the parts and complete the necessary assembly in the spare parts box. Then we need to fix and maintain the frozen alive device state and adjust the adaptability with the adapter port. Also, I need to take care of your injuries. Cough, cough, cough. Luo Nan spoke too fast and he had to switch time units in the middle. His breathing was uneven, so he couldn't help but cough in the end. My injuries? In the shadows, Lieutenant Xiang Min seemed to sneer, but still agreed. 1 second, get ready. Luo Nan didn't speak anymore. He calmed his breathing and shifted a short distance forward. His hand had just extended over when the two sides of the cabin split open, exposing the upper region of the spare parts trunk. The locking mechanism of the spare parts box opened amidst fine noises in the next instant. Luo Nan had a plan in mind. He scooped up the required modules and components and tossed them into the cabin. At the same time, dozens of flying ants beside him took off with a buzz. They marked out auxiliary lines in the air that only Luo Nan could understand, describing the configuration framework. They served as a medium to transmit a portion of his soul strength over. Luo Nan didn't know whether or not this was crossing the line. He couldn't care too much about it. The extremely short time limit forced him to use every method possible. Only after the syncopator had begun working did he extend his hand into the spare parts trunk and join in the assembly work. Luo Nan's assembly speed was so fast that the external vertical collar dynamo core was unable to keep up with the tempo at certain nodes. The dynamo core was faintly heating up at the back of his neck. Oh, or maybe it was because he wasn't used to violating the rules. Close the cabin. Thanks to Lieutenant Go Ye's standardization and foresight in loading the relevant modules, Luo Nan didn't need to use a full second. He was even notified ahead of time, and the cabin door immediately closed. Get ready to accelerate. Luo Nan shouted loudly. Then he immediately lay on the floor of the cabin. He extended his arm to grab the usable tools and spare parts that he had casually tossed out. He had just completed the series of actions when the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation was like a sports car that had stepped on the accelerator all the way down. It shot out with a speed several times faster than before amidst the explosive rumble. It practically crossed the majority of the remaining natural rock formation canyon in an instant. It was infinitely close to the location of the Base 077 infrastructure module. At this point, its speed suddenly dropped and it returned to its original level. It even dropped a bit. But no matter what, it was getting closer and closer to the blocking position. From beginning to end, the spare parts box and more than half of the modules and accessories inside did not enter the cabin. They had already completed their mission. It was nothing more than a single-use propeller. His train of thought is so crude and straightforward that it's scary. Lieutenant Xiang Min's hoarse voice could still be considered steady, but speaking these dispensable evaluations proved that there were fluctuations in her state of mind. The instantaneous acceleration just now pushed Luo Nan directly to the rear of the cabin. He slammed into the cabin wall with banging sounds. He chuckled twice. No matter what was said, this simple single-use propeller allowed Mobile Squad 9 and the escort personnel to move the depth of the battlefield by a large margin into the Base 077 infrastructure module. They were already under the protection of the blocking position. They wouldn't need to engage in a life-and-death struggle with the assault beetles. This could pull back many people in an instant. Of course, Luo Nan also knew that the core of his mission this time was to ensure that the important person within the freeze-to-life installation was still Sir Shi Yuan. He had to transport him back to the blocking position in a stable state and then transfer him to the interior of the base. From the looks of things, it was still relatively stable. The explosive power of the single-use propeller was still within the range that the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation could bear. Though Luo Nan's plan was crude and straightforward, it had a relatively reliable basis. Luo Nan was not prepared to explain in detail to Lieutenant Xiang Min. After all, the vanguard of the assault beetles was still 100 meters away. The enemy's aerial and long-range attacks could regroup at any time. Now was far from the time to chat. After laughing twice, Luo Nan struggled to get up. He organized the tools and spare parts he had just protected and began to reassemble. Luo Nan's position at the rear of the cabin was getting closer and closer to Lieutenant Xiang Min. Without the obstruction of the freeze-to-life installation, they could look each other in the eye when they raised their heads. Of course, they could only see each other's exoskeleton armors. Lieutenant Xiang Min sat in a semi-concave corner at the edge of the cabin wall. She bent one leg and extended the other. Her posture looked rather lazy, but she was actually controlling the injuries on her waist and abdomen. It was a rather heavy injury. Luo Nan only shot a glance in that direction before lowering his head to do the work in his hands. He needed to check the state of the freeze-to-life installation and perform a signal link. He needed Lieutenant Xiang Min's authority, and the other side cooperated without any hindrance. Luo Nan's current work was different from his previous capricious disposable propeller project. He realized that the freeze-to-life installation was a necessary prerequisite for the docking of the interface between the freeze-to-life installation and the sniper position. Xiang Min could certainly understand what he was doing. More importantly, if the transport vehicle had come over in one piece, then this wouldn't have happened. The outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation had traveled nearly half the distance through the crack at the front of the GHI-077. Luo Nan's adjustment work was more or less completed. Most of the most important work was already completed. Luo Nan could finally shift his attention to Lieutenant Xiang Min's side. He observed her injuries and evaluated whether or not she was competent in the transfer work that was about to be carried out soon. Xiang Min's gaze had already rested on Luo Nan's body for a long time. She spoke with a hoarse voice. Go Yi and Xianzhu didn't have much use? How did you discover my injuries? I figured it out from the configuration. Luo Nan didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. He spoke the truth. Right now, whether it was the freeze-to-life installation before his eyes, or Xiang Min who was bound to the installation, or Mobile Squad 9, Go Yi, Xianzhu and Liang Lu who were linked to his array one after another. Of course, this included the ceaselessly approaching sniper position, the various officers and soldiers on the position. He could even extend this to the front lines of the battlefield and even the entire relay station system structure. Everything was in the form of a configuration. It existed in his cognition only in detail and in rough form. Luo Nan could faintly sense that the several thousand nodes on the battlefield formed a standard battle array. Even though nodes were constantly dimming and disappearing, the grand system formed from them still forcefully established a common order that belonged to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's army within the violent and chaotic battle situation at the front lines. The overall situation was like this, and the details were also like this. He was temporarily in Mobile Squad 9, and he was currently in the outer cabin of the freeze-to-life installation. Whether it was a person or an object, they were all a part of this common order. Even though the circumstances they faced were more or less different, they were able to draw support from this common order to forcefully dispel a portion of the pressure. They could erase certain chaotic variables and obtain a powerful reinforcement that far exceeded their individual strength. Correspondingly, they also had to obey the basic principles of this grand system. They had to construct a tight collective domain to form a stable battle fortress. Understanding this rule allowed one to rapidly judge and grasp many changes within the system. Of course, Luo Nan was far from being able to see through the ultimate rule. However, the real-time state of the freeze-to-life installation, the severity of Xiang Min's injuries, and the changes in the battlefield situation within a short period of time were all within the scope of his knowledge. He laughed and walked to the side of the freeze-to-life installation. He extended his hand and pressed lightly on the translucent cabin cover. He turned his head to look at Xiang Min. Lieutenant, you're deeply bound to this installation. You're using the dynamo core to realize control, and you're drawing support from the standard array to ensure the stability of the environment. But the leeway you've given yourself is too small. Right now, you need to share some of the pressure. Chapter 933. What Luo Nan said was not a suggestion, but a solution given from the standpoint of a maintenance soldier. A considerable portion of the assembly he did before was in service of this solution. His superiors, the technical director Go Yi and Xianzhu, did not raise any objections. At the very least, they maintained their silence. However, as the only person in the medical sequence present, Lieutenant Xiang Min needed to communicate with him. The pressure is shifting. Where is it shifting? It's mainly this part of the mechanical structure as well as the lost functionality of the rear half of the cabin. Luo Nan extended his hand and stroked the dimly lit air as he spoke, causing a visual projection to appear. A portion of the assembled mechanical modules lit up, and then a few areas of the bulkhead lit up. The syncopator outside of Luo Nan's body did not stop. It marked out the relevant configuration sketch in the air, and there were corresponding trajectories of light to connect them. Lieutenant Xiang Min's fully covered helmet twisted slightly following Luo Nan's marking. Clearly she was following Luo Nan's train of thought. She was seriously observing and thinking. Luo Nan did not give her too much time. His finger quickly swiveled and tapped his chest. "There's still me. You? I'm the regulating valve. Right now this design can only be manually operated. Of course all of this is just an intermediate link. In the end all of the shifting pressure will be borne by the entire array. I will do my best to direct it towards the non-combat sequence. It would be best if it was directed towards the position to avoid affecting the assault squad behind. This requires a certain level of authority, but I believe my superiors will take care of it." Luo Nan's speed of speech was already raised to the extreme. Lieutenant Go Yi coughed in the channel belonging to the maintenance team, but Officer Xianzhu responded clearly, "The plan is feasible. I can't see the regulating valve too clearly, but as long as the front is fine, the rear half of the cabin will only be crushed by the shifting pressure even if something happens." And the maintenance soldier himself. Stuffing the fleshly body inside is the most foolish action, but the core is brilliant. Lieutenant Go Yi finally opened his mouth to evaluate. He stabbed at Luo Nan, but he was not stingy with his words of praise. After all, Luo Nan's plan was the most feasible among all the plans that could be conceived on the spot. More importantly, it required the least amount of tools and spare parts. The transport vehicle that had fallen apart was no longer capable of supporting the more complex mechanical modules. Moreover, if they had to go to the front of the blocking formation to redo it, not only would it waste time, but it would also waste a lot of lives and precious fighter aircrafts. In the end, Go Yi only added 1 point. This is a semi-open working environment, so the chances of contamination are very high. However, it meets the requirements of the Level 2 pollution response. We have to pay attention to the follow-up treatment. I think it's feasible. This kind of evaluation was obviously shared across multiple channels. The conversation group that Lieutenant Xiang Min was in must have received it, and perhaps there were even higher-level decision-makers. In short, Go Yi and Xianzhu gave Luo Nan a solid endorsement. Luo Nan's confident, unyielding, and decisive design became the most convincing element. In the end, Lieutenant Xiang Min only said, "You'd better ensure your stamina. I have 2 tubes of enhancers here." Luo Nan grinned. Of course no one could see him. "I also have a tube." Enhancers were, in fact, military stimulants. In critical situations, they were used to ensure the soldiers' condition or to forcefully prolong their lives. Luo Nan's current physical strength was indeed another variable, but this wasn't a laboratory. There were no perfect conditions to speak of. In fact, Luo Nan had already begun operating when Lieutenant Xiang Min spoke. The number of centimeters increased a bit more. They danced up and down within the sealed cabin. They were actually doing the final modifications to the design of the freezing device and the space between the 2 people. At the same time they also became carriers. They were set up at various important nodes. Luo Nan only used the time of a single breath to complete all the preparatory work. Corresponding to this, he had modified and optimized the design many times in his brain and in the maintenance group channel. Go Yi and Xianzhu, these 2 veteran maintenance soldiers, had done a great deal of work behind the scenes, supplementing Luo Nan's deficiencies in the mechanical structure. The embryonic form of the pressure discharge tunnel had already been constructed. Luo Nan was still following his own plan. He made detailed modifications step by step, requesting to transfer out the standard Sub-3 type array group array. Proof. The interface for the assault position maintenance group has been opened. Hiss. Luo Nan sucked in a breath of cold air. It wasn't that he was startled. It was just that the instantaneous load on his body and soul was a bit excessive. He had rapidly adjusted the state of his energy and even the details of his body and soul frame in an extremely short amount of time. In any case, he was able to smoothly complete the relevant steps. In this way, Luo Nan, the flood discharge valve, would have minimal impact on Mobile Squad 9, who were on the front lines of the assault, regardless of success or failure. Mobile Squad 9's group channel was cut off. Xianzhu's words popped up in the maintenance group channel. "Well done. Yan Xian transferred this to you. It's really not bad to be able to reach this step." Lieutenant Xiang Min interjected, "Do you need strengthening elements?" "Not for now." Luo Nan grinned. He had yet to step into the threshold of the furnace deployment technique by the standards of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. His fleshly body cultivation wasn't worth mentioning, but his foundation was still quite solid. There was no need to talk about how he had taken the medicine to verify formatting theory in his early years. Gym Master Shio had taught him the 9 orifices 6 roots technique. His internal organs, tendons, bones, and skin were all practiced. His 4 limbs and hundreds of bones were smooth inside and out. He was also a standard fleshly awakened. With the support of his keen perception of configuration, such adjustments were still within the scope of his abilities. He even had the spare energy to do other things. For example, when some equipment was missing, he could bestow his own exoskeleton armor with additional functions through fine adjustments to the body and soul frame. He could temporarily act as a conductor, connecting the mechanical modules and the bulkhead to form an even smoother flood discharge channel. And since Luonan had already linked up with the array that Go Yi and the others were in, the area of the flood discharge area had expanded to cover the entire blocking position. According to what he said to Lieutenant Shang Min, the leeway had increased. It had truly increased. Lieutenant Shang Min was the one who could sense the changes the most. Her half-curled body unconsciously stretched out a bit. The gentle feeling of relaxation caused her to believe that she had received a direct blessing from the jade crystal array within the base for an instant. But clearly the jade crystal array, which was still in a state of repair, didn't have the leisure to do so. Strictly speaking, the negative energy that accumulated in her body and endlessly devoured her energy and life force didn't decrease or shift. But as the leeway increased, the standard array had more room to operate with its individual blessings and enhancements. Shang Min had already begun to try standing up. She asked in passing, "You can also import adjustments aside from flood discharge?" Luonan responded, "Array Liegi has this item. You're stealing the work of our medical sequence." Ha! Shang Min didn't continue on this topic. She panted slightly and relied on her own strength to slowly get up while leaning against the wall of the cabin. She staggered a step and arrived by the side of the freezing live device. She supported the translucent outer shell with her hand and confirmed the state of Sir Yuan within. The outer cabin of the freezing live device had already arrived at the middle and rear section of the fissure tunnel of GH077. It was only 100 meters away from the blocking position, which had already become a strong city. Luonan was familiar with Earth time, so it would only take around 10 seconds for him to arrive. Just from the distance, success was already at hand. But Sir Yuan was in a frozen state. He couldn't hold on, or perhaps the device's transfer was unsuccessful. Everything in front of him was for naught. Luonan subconsciously held his breath. It was unknown how many people were the same as him at this moment. Then he heard Lieutenant Shang Min sigh in relief with his own ears. She turned her head to look at him. Her metal visor was ice cold, but her voice was warm. The tool is an extension of the human body. The human body is also an advanced form of the tool. Only the soul is in control. You're quite classical. Luonan still wasn't too clear on the classical definition of the heavenly Yuan Empire. He could only laugh foolishly. Yeah. Shang Min's gossip proved the effectiveness of Luonan's plan and execution. Perhaps the entire blocking position let out a long sigh of relief in this instant. The work entered a stable state. The vertical collar chip on the back of Luonan's neck endlessly transferred data to the blocking position's transfer and maintenance module. Lieutenant Shang Min had something similar, but it was only limited to the freezing live device itself. It was also the core of all other designs and equipment services. Luonan didn't need to worry about it. The AI system established a real-time correspondence between these data for the executors to refer to. Luonan's authority was expanding, and he was exposed to more and more information. This included a portion of the base taking the initiative to open up to him. But at the same time there were a few more subtle things. They gradually appeared as he operated special operations that hovered on the line of compliance and violation. The range and depth of Luonan's senses were both expanding. He still couldn't wander into the void as he pleased. But in this environment, where the dynamo core was the central axis that linked people and objects together, possessing a solid material foundation and a unique array system, his mental senses seemed to have a place of use. Especially the rapid absorption, digestion, and analysis of complex information. This was Luonan's forte as a psychic. Gradually, Luonan's consciousness began to drift. The restrictions of the special environment were a bit loose. It was as if he had pushed aside the fog of war in the front lines. He was able to observe and appreciate the formatted space, constructed by the standard battle array. No, it was the bloodshed field, the myriad of formations and evolutions. Although the vast majority of the changes followed a pattern that Luonan could understand, the bloodshed field, was able to realize an even higher level of operation by relying on these basic patterns. Needless to say, even a part of it was able to ascend to a higher level in a short amount of time. It was able to contend against tyrannical existences like the infernal tyrant and the magnetic mica jellyfish. Unfortunately, he couldn't understand anything at this level. It was just a blur. Luonan's state of mind was still quite stable. There were many things he couldn't understand in this mystical game scene constructed by the simulator of the inner universe. But as long as the disparity in the flow of time existed for a long period of time, he would have a lot of time to study it. A marvelous scene suddenly appeared in the space of a thought. Luonan saw two of himself. One was sleeping in a spacious bedroom. The entire scene was frozen like an engraving. The other was standing in a narrow cabin. His movements weren't big, but every instant presented a dizzying abundance of detail. The clear directionality of the scene made Luonan quickly realize that this was him in reality and in the game. Sure enough, the flow of time on both sides was different. But then again, he could feel from the instantaneous cross-section that the difference wasn't particularly shocking. It was somewhat contrary to the conclusion deduced by logic. Or perhaps they were converging. Luonan's thoughts were a mess. The scene returned to nothingness. But he finally understood what he needed to understand. From this moment onwards, the time he spent in the game scene was clearly restricted by the true environment of Earth's spacetime. He was about to reach his limit. Chapter 934. Luonan still did not understand the reason for the formation of the limits, just as he did not understand the working mechanism of the inner universe simulator. His mind was inevitably a bit chaotic. The outer cabin of the maglev vehicle had already entered the area 50 meters from the blocking position at this time. Lieutenant Xiang Min began to communicate with the position, activating the connection between the freeze-alive device and the transfer module in advance to preset it. The outer region of the infrastructure module, Micro-G06, lit up with a faint radiance. It was an arc of light caused by the transfer module's energy coming into contact with the air. The outer cabin of the freeze-alive device had already gradually reduced its maglev driving force. It echoed with the transfer module from a distance and began to enter the docking orbit. Therefore, the outer cabin's propulsion speed decreased a step further. According to Luonan's estimations, it would take at least 10 seconds to complete this part of the orbit according to Earth time standards. From this moment on, the mission entered the most critical stage. Luonan forced himself to restrain his thoughts. He didn't want to waste his brain on a situation that could no longer be reversed. He poured his energy into monitoring the state of important targets such as Lieutenant Xiang Min, the frozen life device, and the transfer module installed in the Micro-G06. It could be imagined that Luonan wasn't the only one who was focused on these targets. It wasn't just Luonan who was staring at this scene. There were even AI systems performing real-time calculations to detect the corresponding relationship between the data of both sides. Any tiny flaw would trigger an alarm. The docking process was destined to not be smooth sailing. Having lost the complete facilities of the transfer vehicle, it was impossible for Luonan's hasty emergency response to be flawless. The outer cabin of the freeze-alive device only advanced 15 meters or so on the docking orbit. Alarms and stimulating blood-colored information popped out one after another. It was not a fatal design error, but it was limited by conditions. The docking process required a large amount of automatic calculations, timing, and quantitative work. Now, most of it had to be done manually. This required the support of large amounts of frequent high-precision operations by the controller. Lieutenant Xiang Min had thought of this the moment she decided to split the transport vehicle into pieces. She was mentally prepared for this long ago. She responded quite calmly, truly displaying the standard of an elite lieutenant of the medical sequence. Lieutenant Xiang Min did not avoid Luonan during this time. She even intentionally showed him all the two-way communication information and operating procedures so that he could make a timely response. Luonan was just watching for fun when it came to Lieutenant Xiang Min's specialized information. His chaos translation mechanism was far from being able to accurately translate it. He could not intervene for a time. However, Luonan still gained something in the end. Luonan looked at this extremely precise special system that was built upon the foundation of spacetime configuration. It went from a high degree of automation to a level of manual operation. It was true that dangers were everywhere, but it was tantamount to cutting open the black box of the system. It allowed Luonan to peek at a certain aspect of the spacetime structure and its application mode on the concrete configuration. Most importantly, Lieutenant Xiang Min's personal strength was around the level of a grade B architect. When performing such a high-standard and difficult operation, she had to rely on the buff of bloodshed land. Luonan followed the logic of Lieutenant Xiang Min's operation and observed the process and results of her original positioning within the standard array as well as the upgrade of her privileges. Luonan pondered over many things outside of the basic operation and his consciousness naturally entered a deeper region. Gradually he was able to learn more. He wanted to observe bloodshed land from a different angle and find more things to compare it to. He wanted to use an inaccurate but vivid metaphor to describe this vast and complicated formation system that was deeply rooted in the material plane but did not possess any material substance. Yes, right now Luonan felt that bloodshed land was like an enormous digestive system in a certain aspect. It was constantly resisting large amounts of external pressure, dissolving them layer by layer. At the same time, it also had to bear the burden of many chaotic elements that did not conform to the rules. It had to do its best to deal with these elements cleanly. It swallowed trash and even bombs, but it needed to go through a complicated cycle to digest it without affecting its material foundation. It even needed to convert a portion of it into effective energy to be re-exported and reutilized. This was simply an incomparably enormous negative entropy generator. In other words, its power was order. But Luonan could not say for sure whether it was order that gave it power, or whether it was itself that produced order. Luonan's understanding of bloodshed land grew deeper and deeper. The configuration structure and the corresponding changes he could observe became more numerous. But no matter how ever-changing and magnificent these structures and changes were, they were all rooted in strict and solid order and rules. There were no exceptions. At least this was the case on the front lines of the battlefield that Luonan saw. Every soldier of the Heavenly Yuan Empire was a basic node of this system. They followed the basic rules of the array system. This did not mean that everyone was a marionette, but the source of the power system that they cultivated and originated from this. All of the spiritual changes were integrated into it, forming a benefit to the system itself. Of course, in order to radiate the value of this benefit, one needed to be an outstanding expert to achieve it. Luonan's thoughts gradually spread deeper and deeper, touching upon a few similar, strong radiation points. Especially the one at the front lines, the one that was resisting the tyrannical external force outside of the array system. The so-called tyrannical external force was the legendary Hellfire Tyrant. The rules of the domain manifested by it were weaker by a level or two, but they were exactly the same as the remnants of the dazzling flames on this side of the canyon. They were overflowing with violent destructive power. Luonan felt a hard-to-suppress dizziness with just a slight contact. As for the person that could contend against it, Lieutenant Lu Andy? Luonan subconsciously turned his head to look at the unconscious Sir Shi Yuan in the freezing device. The doubts that he had when he first saw this person were finally answered. What followed was another feeling of exclamation. No wonder Liang Lu respected Lu Andy so much. That war hero could actually go to this extent. But then again, wasn't this the ultimate marvel of the power of the bloodshed domain? Luonan was able to observe more information through the strong radiation point of Lu Andy. He saw that the remnants of the Hellfire Tyrant's rule domain were constantly weakening. It was no longer enough to contend against the majestic array at the front lines. However, as the number of assault beetles and other servant armies stuffed into the front lines, especially in the direction of the canyon, continued to increase, the new interference power was rapidly rising. There was no doubt that this came from the magnetite mica jellyfish. It came from an enemy whose explosive power might not be as strong, but its stability far exceeded that of a senior lord. The laws and domains of the three parties had their own strengths and weaknesses. Even the weakest Hellfire on the tyrant's side, there were certain areas and times where they were strong. Even the most stable bloodshed land would have a momentary weakness. The magnetophoton mica jellyfishes were always mobilizing their power and trying to infiltrate the formation, creating one wound after another in the formation. Many blurry things could not be seen directly, but they could be roughly deduced through comparison. Then they could be verified through the various changes that currently appeared. Luan's direction was a point of reference. Wasn't the current blocking position the same? In terms of tactical position, this place was already more important than Luan's. It had become the most prominent focal point of the front lines. The freezing device was the key to everything. From Luan's direction to the blocking position, it just so happened to be the route where the center of gravity of the battlefield shifted. It was also the most efficient verification channel. Luonan grasped the logic of the center of gravity shift. The originally chaotic information was self-explanatory. He could sense the waxing and waning changes in the power and state of all sides. He could turn his head and capture the minute effects brought about by the changes in the overall situation through Lieutenant Xiang Min's specific operations. His eyes could look at the overall situation, but he could also focus on the details. He could verify them back and forth. He could gain something at any time. For a time, a flash of inspiration flowed. There was no rest. His mind and spirit were all transformed. He was intoxicated. At this stage, Luonan's mission became a trivial matter. It wasn't that he had forgotten about the other. It was that in the process of mutual verification of the overall situation and the details, his auxiliary mechanical structure was no longer difficult. At the very least, this was the case on the level of configuration design. He would immediately take over and adjust some minor problems. He absolutely wouldn't drag Lieutenant Xiang Min down. It was just that the docking orbit wasn't long and the time was too short. As Luonan gradually entered a wonderful state, Lieutenant Xiang Min suddenly let out a long sigh and stopped operating. The parameters of the freezing device and the transferring device were completely verified at this moment. Right now, there was only a distance of 5 meters between the outer cabin of the freezing device and the infrastructure module, Microgen 06. The transferring device was already half turned on. Together with the freezing device, an invisible force field isolated from the external environment was established. A stable connection was established between the two. Luonan sighed and let out a sigh of relief. It was also at this time that he discovered that his energy seemed to have clearly weakened. His body was drenched in sweat. Even the self-cleaning function of his combat uniform was somewhat unable to withstand it. His power, the power that belonged solely to him, was rapidly flowing away. Moreover, it was constantly accelerating. Luonan subconsciously leaned against the wall of the cabin. He felt his body transform into a whole, a rare experience of constantly devouring energy. Lieutenant Xiang Min discovered Luonan's abnormality. She reached out her hand to probe. From Luonan's perception, this simple action instantly gathered the 30 or so basic configurations that the bloodshed domain had erected around him. It formed a kind of cluster-type blessing. It was extremely exquisite. Unfortunately, it was useless. Strictly speaking, Luonan's power flowing away did not belong to this dimension. Don't worry about me. Focus. Luonan didn't know whether or not this situation would cause confusion for Xiang Min, so he put on an appearance of awe-inspiring righteousness. But before he could finish speaking, his mind stirred and he blurted out, "Air attack! Be careful." At nearly the same time, the various channels that Luonan was in rang densely with air attack alarms. Chapter 935. Luonan had completed a brilliant early warning. This was the specialty of the mental side, but it wasn't easy to do in the current situation. It was difficult to release soul strength into the void, and it could be wantonly extended. Luonan was able to deduce the corresponding signs from the details of the conflicting laws of the three sides. Then he captured the corresponding target. The pterosaur army was mobilized by the magnetic mica jellyfish regardless of the cost. They forcefully broke through the blockade and made a suicidal attack in the direction of the blocking position. Some of them displayed the characteristics of the assault beetles. When their broken bodies swept past the canyon area at low altitude, they brought with them raging flames. Every time they spat out acid bombs, they would also catalyze the most insidious flames. It was like a rapid rain of fire that was blown by the wind, pouring down on the defensive line. The outer cabin of the freezing device was still at the outer edge of the fortress. Of course, it was within the range of the rain of fire. However, the damage of the rain of fire was dealt with by the defensive system of the blocking position. Luonan didn't need to worry about it. From his perspective, there was nothing more realistic than the fact that his early warning still had some errors, in a relatively higher level domain. Earlier than the pterosaur air raid, a heavy magnetic spirit hammer fell from the sky. It was a powerful attack from the main body of the magnetic mica jellyfish. Luonan wasn't clear on the specific mechanism of the magnetic spirit hammer, but he was able to observe and sense the surrounding laws and environment the moment this strike fell. It was as if he had been struck by a stun grenade. All order was distorted and turbulent. This caused a considerable negative effect on the defensive system of the blocking position. This was clearly a targeted method of the magnetic mica jellyfish. However, who could be more brilliant than the other in a prolonged confrontation? The bloodshed land had many contingency plans to deal with this situation. After a short period of shock, the entire outer wall of the fortress lit up with pure light. This layer of light was a bit similar to the format of fire. In fact, it was the representation of a myriad of preset configurations that circulated and switched and reassembled. It formed an effect close to an energy shield. It blocked a large portion of the most destructive and corrosive of the rain of fire. At the same time, it suppressed the warping power of the mad magnetic spirit hammer. The two sides went back and forth, calmly dealing with each other. It was quite marvelous. Luo Nan originally loved this sort of scene the most. However, his energy had declined and he had a headache. He really had a headache. The confrontation between the two sides had escalated, and the intensity had increased. This meant that the flow of information, which had been relatively flat before, had suddenly risen to a new level. And it wasn't just one level but several levels. Countless variables were added in the blink of an eye within Luo Nan's range of perception. It involved the immediate responses of the Bloodshed Land, the Magnetite Mica Jellyfish, and the Hellfire Tyrant. Even if the Hellfire Tyrant could be ignored for the time being, the scale of the first two changes was no different from a nuclear bomb explosion in terms of information volume. And they all involved Luo Nan's current observations. They all touched upon the domain that Luo Nan was still in. The changes brought about more references. Luo Nan could see more, but he also had to bear more. The water level of his energy dropped again. Luo Nan didn't even have the strength to stand against the wall. It was also at this moment that he finally understood. Apart from the benefits of the flow of time inside and outside, which had to be built on a foundation of high consumption, wasn't the Innerverse Simulator's analysis, deduction, and simulation of high-level laws the same? The wool comes from the sheep's back. In the end, wouldn't Luo Nan have to support all the expenses alone? A large-scale conflict of this scale involved two sovereign-level fantasy breeds, as well as the bloodshed domain framework of the same level. The simulation of the three high-level laws needed to be synchronized. The Innerverse Simulator, which was Luo Nan, really could not hold on any longer. Luo Nan. This was Lieutenant Xiang Min's call. The changed environment of the rules had caused a few variables to appear in the work of the transfer, which was practically set in stone. This was within her expectations, but Luo Nan, who had always been quick-witted, was clearly slower by half a beat when it came to debugging the transfer equipment. She had no choice but to be sensitive. "How are you?" The question was superfluous, but it reflected the change in Lieutenant Xiang Min's attitude toward Luo Nan. Hearing Xiang Min's call, Luo Nan struggled out of his trance of energy exhaustion. Without any hesitation, he activated the strengthening element storage inside the exoskeleton armor and completed the injection. But he could guess the result. It was probably meaningless. Sure enough, even though Luo Nan's physical strength instantly exploded in this host within the game scene, the soul strength supporting the operation had already been extracted from its roots, consumed. How could it be so easy to replenish? Luckily, Luo Nan already knew how to deal with it. He withdrew most of his scattered telepathic senses and forced himself to stop pondering over the high-level evolution laws of the Bloodshed Land and the magneto-optical mica. He only kept the necessary links to deal with the current work. Though his energy reserves did not improve, they no longer worsened. Luo Nan could finally catch his breath. Are the strengthening elements effective? Xiang Min asked another useless question. Yes. Luo Nan was a man of few words. Then continue. Xiang Min pretended not to see Luo Nan's weak and trembling legs. She chose to continue trusting the young maintenance soldier in front of her. Luo Nan also chose to accept this trust. Even though his current state was terrible, he was barely able to maintain the necessary pressure transfer channel. He gathered his limited energy and observed the state of the equipment. He was already at his limit. It was already fortunate that he did not make any mistakes. He really didn't have much time here. Luo Nan didn't calculate the specific amount of energy he had left. He could only concentrate on the matter in front of him. He didn't have the leisure to pay attention to the pterosaur assault group that had already flown above his head and had begun their suicidal attack. Half of the freezing device had already extended into the transfer port. The other transfer vehicle that was already parked inside Microji 06 had already begun its docking. Success was at hand, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Lieutenant Xiang Min entered Luo Nan's eyes and ears. There was also information coming from various directions. Luo Nan wasn't able to understand much of it, and he was unable to delve into the meaning within. He treated it as pure garbage information, allowing it to flash by. After a few flashes, Luo Nan's extremely limited energy made it hard for him to continue with the specific mechanical structure and debugging work. So he tossed away the burden once more. His field of focus was completely locked on the configuration level. He ensured that the structure of this area was maintained within a reasonable range. The buzzing flying ants were still fluttering within the cabin, representing Luo Nan's remaining vitality. It was through this medium that he was able to correct the errors in the material plane. Luo Nan chose the method he was best at in his weakest moment. How could he have the strength to judge whether or not this method of work was truly labor-saving and whether or not it conformed to the norms of the drill manual? In any case, Go Yi and Xianzhu didn't stop him, right? If things continued like this, he could still persevere. He could persevere. F***CK. Earth's characteristic curse words sprayed out from Luo Nan's mouth, but they were so vague that even he couldn't hear them clearly. They were just a small stimulant that gave his dazed consciousness a fierce stab. This was because at this moment, a new power of rule, a power that was different from the bloodshed domain, the magnetic mica jellyfish, and the inferno tyrant, spread out from the depths of the void. Luo Nan didn't know where its source was due to the contraction of his perception, but this rule was far too unique. It could be said to be a rule, but it was more like a natural crack in the depths of the void. With just a slight vibration, it suddenly split open. The void split open, and everything it carried changed along with it. The bloodshed domain looked weak because it wasn't facing the forceful tearing and explosive attack of the inferno tyrant. Instead, it was being dissected like a butcher dismembering an ox. The new power of rule didn't even touch the strict barrier of the bloodshed domain. Instead, it directly tore apart the foundation it relied on. The spacetime structure of the bloodshed domain certainly had its own system of rules. But in the face of this kind of destruction that was infinitely close to primordial, the tightness of the rules simply didn't have enough time to display its effect. Cracks had already appeared. This kind of crack was irregular. It was like lightning striking down on a rainy day. Every branch and every trajectory was different. No one knew where the crack would lead to. Luo Nan and Lieutenant Shang Min were the more unlucky ones. Noiselessly, the rear area of the outer cabin of the freezing device was cut in half. The invisible blade practically brushed past the back of Shang Min's and Luo Nan's heads and the tips of their noses. In reality, there was no such coincidence. It was just that Luo Nan had dozens of syncopators acting as guides and scapegoats. At this time, if the new power of rule continued to display its primordial effect, it was not impossible for the affected area of the bloodshed domain to fall apart. But at this moment, it was hard for this new special power of rule to maintain its primordial purity. Instead, it produced some sort of chemical reaction with the current spacetime environment. A fuzzy silhouette grew rapidly. It was as if the main body hidden in the ruptured spacetime gap had jumped out. Another sovereign-level fantasy breed? Luo Nan only caught a glimpse of a fuzzy shadow. His judgment wasn't right or wrong. Luo Nan had sensed the series of changes mentioned above. It was very clear and complete. After all, this was the domain he was most proficient in. The problem was that Luo Nan was willing to be blind. Luo Nan had clearly blocked it, but the clear information of the changes in the void was still deeply engraved. It added more variables to the complicated situation of the three parties entangled together. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. He really couldn't hold on any longer. Luo Nan saw himself in a deep sleep state once more. Earlier, he saw Her Majesty Empress Wu's private airship, a projection of water vapor that had exploded and dispersed. Yes, in the real world, the soul cloak that had originally covered the entire world was rapidly shrinking. It was no longer enough to support the consumption of several thousand kilometers. From the current situation, the consumption was simply shocking. The barrier between the game scene and the real world had become exceptionally weak at this moment. It seemed that Luo Nan just needed to fall back and he would fall out from the boundary between the two, realizing his return. It was at this time that he heard Lieutenant Go Yi yell in the channel. Shadow cockroach. Chapter 936. Shadow cockroach? Luo Nan should have seen this name or a similar name in the database related to the Outer Realm species. However, he no longer had the space to recall. He was unable to make a further reaction. His energy had already been squandered on the support and analysis of the high-level evolution of the laws. He had a bit of energy left over to deal with the killing move of the shadow cockroach that sliced through the void. He had indeed blocked the first wave of death. The dozens of syncopators on the ground had already turned to slag. They had blocked the disaster in place of Luo Nan, Lieutenant Shang Min and Sir Shi Yuan. But the second wave. Luo Nan watched helplessly as the shadow cockroach's main body appeared in the void. It was just like an extended wraith. It wanted to swallow the freezing device, the outer cabin, and the 3 people involved in the critical moment of the connection in one gulp. A powerful light exploded in this area at this moment. Fortunately, Luonan was wearing a full helmet and a metal visor. The light particles were filtered, and Luonan's eyes only blurred for an instant. Then the panoramic simulation's field of vision was restored to normal. There was just a bit of thermal noise brought about by the powerful light. Most importantly, there was still a bit missing. Xiangmin's calm voice rang out. The flash ray hit. The shadow cockroach construct disintegrated. F***CK. How the F***CK did you do that? Xianzhu's Tianyuan style of foul language spread wantonly in the channel. Luonan really wanted to learn from him. Who could explain why the terrifying fantasy breed, which could easily tear apart the void, was reduced to ashes after a wave of powerful light passed through? This shock even gave him a new stimulation. It made his mind forcefully pull itself together. He glanced at the virtual interface of his left eye and saw the timely short information explanation: shadow cockroach and outer realm species. When entering other planes of space and time, there is a high probability that it will tear apart the structure of space and time. It will react with the invaded environment to form a construct. Shadow cockroach is relatively weak and fears strong light. Luonan's head grew dizzy. Looking at this explanation, it seemed well done. Xiangmin turned her head in the midst of pressing matters and spoke to Luonan. Xianzhu's emotional reaction just now wasn't directed at Xiangmin, who was executing according to the drill manual. It was because of Luonan's forceful closing of the space-time rift. Unfortunately, Luonan was destined to be unable to answer him. It could be said that Luonan didn't think at all in that instant. It was completely out of instinct. He used the syncopator to mobilize all the configuration modules in the surroundings that could be used. He probably made a small-scale space-time barrier? He really didn't have any recollection of it. In that state of his, the structure of time and space that he depended on was torn apart, and his entire body was about to collapse. How could he have the time to think calmly? Luonan's train of thought became more and more erratic. Otherwise, he wouldn't have wasted precious time on Xianzhu's rather untimely reaction. Of course, the current stage of Luonan's focus was far too demanding. Luonan was able to control his upper and lower eyelids from fighting. It could already be said that his willpower was firm. The changes in the situation did not change according to his state and will. Instead, they happened one after another. Axle 2, speed limit to 4. Xiangmin's concise instructions were transmitted into Luonan's mind, which completely conformed to the norms of the drill manual. Luonan shuddered once more, and his muddled consciousness found a direction for the time being. At this moment he couldn't even move a hair from head to toe. If he really tried to do it, he would probably fall back to Earth. It was only through thinking that he could roughly grasp the corresponding configuration structure and attempt to adjust the relevant equipment. However, Luonan was absent-minded for a moment. It seemed like he was missing something? Yes, there weren't enough syncopators. He had brought a base number of 132 syncopators, and right now most of them had become scapegoats. They had turned into slag and scattered on the ground. Oh, if it wasn't enough, then it wasn't enough. In any case, he could do it. The corresponding thought only lasted for an instant. He didn't think too deeply before he put it into action. The frame of Luonan's body and soul interacted with the external vertical collar dynamo core. He transformed his own strength into electromagnetic waves and other material wavelengths. He controlled the remaining 40 or so syncopators and adjusted their positions within the cabin. They formed a relatively sealed force field structure, allowing his soul strength to shuttle within. This was the basic train of thought and requirements of the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military drill. Luonan still followed the basic train of thought, but the lack of material conditions made it impossible for him to completely conform to the standards of the drill. His operation was already pressing down on the safety line, but under these circumstances he directly broke through the safety line. Unsurprisingly, the vertical collar dynamo core sounded an alarm and attempted to correct it. The problem was, even though Luonan was extremely weak and had reached the limits of his physiology and mind at the same time, how could a mere external dynamo core be able to restrain him with his extraordinary attainments in soul strength? After entering the game scene, Luonan abided by the rules and obeyed the constraints. This was only out of respect for the Heavenly Yuan system, and he also hoped to obtain a more complete experience. But right now he was exhausted and his mind was absent-minded. How could he care so much? He naturally operated and crossed the limits of the vertical collar dynamo core. It was only equivalent to crossing a small threshold. And then he lost control. In his half-conscious state, all of Luo Nan's execution logic was subservient to his personal instincts. He did what was familiar and comfortable. His soul strength spread out in the void. Luo Nan didn't even pay attention to the specific operation of his soul strength. After limiting the speed of the number 2 axis, he completely bid farewell to the word control and this concept. He just let himself be, fusing his biological instincts into his soul strength. There was no difference. His eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and intent all spread out along with the expansion of his soul strength. This naturally increased the range and level of Luo Nan's clairvoyance. In a certain sense, Luo Nan grew weaker and weaker, but he also grew clearer and clearer. Under the pure sensing of the psychic eye, the inside and outside of the relay station, the surrounding battlefield, the 3 tangled and conflicted sides, and even the laws and sources of their respective mobilizations of power all appeared in an unprecedented panoramic view. What should be blurry remained blurry, but Luo Nan had never experienced the great outline and layout of the collusion, ever since he entered the game scene. The expansion of his soul strength was extremely fast. The complex battle situation surrounding the relay station was imprinted in Luo Nan's mind in the time it took to flash a thought. His mind had a range of cognition, so it naturally needed to increase its level. The sea of consciousness, the abyss region, the polar domain, so it turned out that the level division of the mental domain was the same here? Perhaps this was the universal truth of the universe? Luo Nan was unable to look too carefully. He just had a general understanding that the sea of consciousness and the abyss region here were much more orderly than those on Earth. There were similarities and differences in the 3 levels. It was like the scenery of a foreign country. It was quite interesting. But Luo Nan couldn't remember too much for a time. He didn't have the energy to distinguish them. It was more and more like a dream, drifting leisurely all the way to the polar domain. At the very least, Luo Nan felt that this was more or less the level. But in his days, the so-called polar domain was poles apart from Luo Nan's impression. The difference was so great that he was unable to ignore it in his current state. He was unable to bypass it. It seemed that the other side wouldn't let him go either. That was chaos. Inexplicable chaos. Fundamental disorder. Indescribable distortions. They were like casual graffiti, splashed paint, and randomly cut curtains. They spread out wantonly and boundless, filling one's field of vision. Accurately speaking, it was the entirety of all sensing dimensions. It didn't leave even the tiniest bit of space. And the other side was still closing in endlessly. It seemed to want to completely stuff this extreme chaos into Luo Nan's eyes and all of his cognition. Luo Nan was startled to the point of sobering up a bit. The polar domain? This sort of thing that was like a rag? Luo Nan found it hard to accept this sort of filthy and absurd thing. It was related to the deep and empty polar domain that he had always known. But the reality was that this chaotic and filthy element occupied the highest point of the mental plane. It was located above the abyss region and the sea of consciousness. And it was still endlessly seeping down, affecting the abyss region, affecting the sea of consciousness, affecting every region and every individual, including Luo Nan. Luo Nan's body seemed to be covered in filth in just the limited amount of time that had passed with clairvoyance. It was as if his soul strength had been soaked in filthy, stinky water. It had lost its clarity and spirituality. A feeling of vexation and nausea exploded in the depths of his heart. Luo Nan wanted to close his eyes and not look, but in the instant he avoided, countless eyes filled with indescribable emotions focused on him. It seemed that he was also one of them. It was as if he was looking at a mirror that had been severely graffitied. Or perhaps this mirror itself was pieced together from countless eyes. Luo Nan still had to strive to find a reason for this encounter in his current state. This chaos really broke through the limits of what he could endure. The problem was that his efforts were quickly drowned out. The chaotic logic continued to expand endlessly. Luo Nan was nearly convinced that he was already splitting apart. Observation and feeling had been severed. Thinking and imagination ran in opposite directions. Even his instincts were at a loss within this chaos. A sharp alarm rang out at this time. Luo Nan groaned miserably, but his consciousness extracted a bit from the chaos. He made a vague judgment. It wasn't from the relay station. It came from the simulator of the innerverse. Then, before Luo Nan could hear the specifics of the information, everything before his eyes suddenly went black. It was as if the system had crashed on a black screen. It didn't reboot. It was good that it didn't reboot. Luo Nan let out a breath of relief. Cold sweat had already drenched the hair on the back of his head. His heart was beating at a rate that was about to ignite a fire within his internal organs. This was vile poison. Vile poison pollution. Luo Nan locked onto this answer almost immediately. But just as this concept became clear in his mind, the chaotic mess and filth that could drive a person insane appeared once more on the black screen that erased all information. It was deeply engraved in his eyes and in his heart. Just its existence alone was enough to cause one's heart to palpitate with fear. F***ck me. Luo Nan's body bounced up and he waved his hand with force. He wanted to wave away these things that were even more vexing than flies in the darkness. Luo Nan waved his arm twice and suddenly woke up. He was truly awake this time. A thin quilt slid down from his body. The quiet and spacious room carried the soft sound of water. He was wearing an exoskeleton armor, withstanding the rain of fire from the sky, and the battlefield environment where many channels of information interweaved. Chapter 937. Luo Nan had already exited the game. However, he didn't even have the time to sigh about anything. The sin poison, that chaotic and dirty elemental energy, wantonly revealed its presence and continued to permeate him. Actually, Luo Nan knew very well in his heart that this was just a fragment of an impression that existed in his memories. There was no real impact to speak of. But it was precisely because there was no substance to it that it lingered and did not disperse. This was what made Luo Nan even more irritated. He forcefully flung the thin blanket on his body to one side, as if he could use this method to completely separate himself from the mess and filth. Of course it was useless. My lord? Luo Nan was in the master bedroom. Snake Tongue's figure was reflected outside the bamboo lattice door. Her tone was a bit hesitant. She seemed uncertain. Luo Nan didn't feel like replying to her. He continued to fight against the corrosion of the chaotic and disorderly impressions. His breathing grew heavier and heavier. 2 seconds passed before the door was pushed open to the side. The sound of wood rubbing against each other was extremely soft and slow. But in Luo Nan's ears right now, it was clearly the most torturous noise. He immediately glared at him angrily. Snake Tongue, who was walking in on her knees, suddenly raised her head and met Luo Nan's gaze head-on. Snake Tongue was startled and then her body tensed up. She sucked in a short breath, and her mouth emitted a loud and clear sound of air. For someone with her temperament, this was already an extreme loss of self-control. The more she acted like this, the more she attracted Luo Nan's attention. Luo Nan stared at Snake Tongue with a fiery rage. Snake Tongue subconsciously wanted to bend her head to avoid his stare, but it seemed that her movements were too large. She stretched her neck, causing her body to go stiff. She couldn't move sideways. It was also as if invisible fingers were pinching her cheeks. She couldn't move freely. What's your name? Luo Nan's voice was dull and hoarse. His voice sounded like dry wood scraping against each other. Snake Tongue couldn't answer. In fact, she couldn't even control her eyelids right now. She wanted to close her eyes, but she could only shake her eyelashes. Soon, the veins on her fair neck and forehead began to bulge and throb slightly. In the end, his entire body was trembling, as if he had seen something extremely terrifying, or perhaps he had been forcefully injected with a fatal poison. You've seen something incredible from me? You can even infect me like this? Luo Nan muttered. Even he himself couldn't hear his muffled voice too clearly. This wasn't a good thing. This was because he could feel that as Snake Tongue was struck, the chaotic and dirty elements suddenly expanded their territory. Many more irregular transformations occurred, making the chaos even more chaotic and harder to control. What the hell? Luo Nan's heart grew more and more restless, to the point where he vented his anger on someone else. It was undoubtedly Snake Tongue's fault. If she hadn't come over to disturb him, things wouldn't have reached this stage. This was what Luo Nan thought in his heart, but the gaze Luo Nan shot over became all the more unkind. The blood drained from Snake Tongue's face. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but it was as if an invisible noose had gripped her neck. All her words were stuck in her throat. Luo Nan, on the other hand, had a gloomy expression. He slowly got up and walked over to Snake Tongue. He sat across from her, sticking extremely close to her. In this way he could indeed see more clearly. In particular, he could sense that Snake Tongue had suddenly lost control of her aura. There was a rather typical quality amidst the chaos. The so-called model was learned from the military drill of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. While Luo Nan was observing Snake Tongue, he subconsciously wanted to cut her open to make a diagnosis. Only then did he realize that there wasn't a syncopator beside him. This was even more vexing. He didn't even bring a tiny syncopator with him when he came out of the game setting. In the end, with just a glance, he had provoked the most dangerous thing on the other side. Should he find someone to reason with? The Interverse Simulator? The corner of Luo Nan's lips twitched. He didn't make a sound. He just extended his hand and touched Snake Tongue's pale cheeks. He didn't have a syncopator, but he understood basic calculation principles. He was barely able to extrapolate. Snake Tongue was trembling. Luo Nan could clearly feel this. Of course she was afraid as well. She was more afraid than she had been in the past. The source of her fear undoubtedly came from Luo Nan. Her gaze was still firmly glued to Luo Nan's face. It was hard for her to move an inch. What in the world did she see? Luo Nan couldn't be too certain. But after performing calculations and comparing the parameters provided by the drill manual, he quickly came to a basic conclusion. It was evil poison without a doubt. Moreover, the process of the evil poison's environmental pollution had begun. Luo Nan laughed. This was a laugh triggered by the absurdity. On Earth? Did he become a carrier of the virus? And the most ludicrous and laughable thing was that he had carried it out from the virtual game setting? What a joke. Snake Tongue let out a cry of pain. Luo Nan subconsciously used his fingers to clasp her cheeks. He exerted some force. She had probably injured some facial muscle or a bone seam or joint somewhere. So, what stupid thing did you do? Luo Nan pressed forward a bit more. The tip of his nose was practically touching the tip of his nose. His forehead was touching her forehead. His voice was hoarse as he spoke to Snake Tongue. The distance was too close. Snake Tongue's gaze was unable to focus. It was already lax. Perhaps this was a good thing for her. She was finally able to break free from some visible terror from Luo Nan's body. Even though her pretty face was a bit deformed from Luo Nan's pinching, the expression on her face was much richer. She even opened and closed her lips to emit a silent word. What? Of course, Luo Nan didn't hear her clearly. His hand unconsciously loosened a bit. Then he heard Snake Tongue's intermittent voice, Your Excellency? You also have fear? Was this awareness? Luo Nan was a bit startled. His absurd emotions immediately magnified, and he laughed involuntarily once more. This pushed his emotions to take a large turn. The flames of irritation and anger suddenly transformed into an absurd and nonsensical casually leaping excitement. He didn't respond to Snake Tongue's question. His hand decreased a bit more force, caressing her smooth skin. He experienced the sensation of the shallowest layer. He wanted to continue watching. He wanted to see the results. He wanted to see how this beautiful skin would mutate and even be destroyed under the terrifying laws of poison. If he continued, this would most likely be realized. As for the reason, curiosity was the reason. Therefore he supported Snake Tongue's face. He looked at the vile environment he had brought back and built with his own hands. He looked at how the chaotic and destructive negative elements seeped into this beautiful body and into her tenacious soul. This was the vile poison of the past. It was currently corroding the framework of her body and soul, the foundation of her cultivation. Perhaps it could be a bit faster? This was insanity. Reason finally shrieked in the corner, heavily pounding on his nerves. You're in an abnormal state. There's a problem with your emotions. You've clearly been infected, but you're excited because of the accelerated destruction of the person you've infected. This is the path to death. Luo Nan should understand, but he was like a hopeless degenerate. He was immersed in the breeding and spreading tendencies of destruction, vainly hoping to obtain feedback from within. The current Luo Nan lacked the patience to deal with complex problems. It didn't matter if he cut through the Gordian knot or if he abandoned himself to despair. He wanted to see the results as soon as possible, regardless of whether it was good or bad. People always had similar mental and emotional ups and downs. But Luo Nan's body was like pressing the fast-forward button. His weak state facilitated this process. Before he could react, he had already collapsed to the point of no return. Reason was like the sound of a mosquito when the heavens fell and the earth split. It clearly existed, but it was powerless. It was just like what he felt when he glimpsed the curtains of the so-called polar domain in the game setting. His perception and thoughts were split and misplaced. From his body to his mind, he was out of balance everywhere. Luo Nan was watching Snake Tongue's destruction. Wasn't he the same? In a certain sense, Snake Tongue was a reflection of his own state. The two of them were grasshoppers tied to the same rope. Both of them were falling apart at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then they completely merged into the extreme chaos and disorder. It was like Luonan was sitting in reverse for a certain instant. Everything he experienced, everything he remembered, everything he learned and everything he cultivated. This included the learning and harvest he gained from the game setting, the growth and advancement he gained from fighting against the Amaterasu Order, the large profits he earned from killing Gong Chi, the explosive increase in his soul strength after erecting the spiderweb of the altar, and even the primordial foundation bestowed upon him by the formatting theory system. The strict assembly of order collapsed one after another, returning to meaningless chaos. It no longer mattered whether this was an illusion or reality. If Luonan truly believed it, then the barrier between reality and illusion would be as fragile as a bubble. Of course Luonan didn't want to believe it. He only had a bit of reason left and he was still struggling. He tried to return to his rightful position and let order dominate everything once more. But his attempts were drowned in the chaotic and misplaced thoughts and emotions. He failed time and time again. Every time he failed, he would cut off a large chunk of the structure of order, throwing it into the abyss of chaos. It wasn't just Luonan himself who was affected in the span of a few breaths. The living starry sky, the large production line, the spiderweb of the altar, and other mental world structures he had built upon the foundation of formatting theory were shaking as well. The destructive power of sin poison was attempting to pollute and destroy everything in one fell swoop. If Luonan's soul strength hadn't been exhausted and completely shrunk, then the entire earth would have fallen in the blink of an eye with the range his soul strength could cover. The sin poison was temporarily unable to spread, but Luonan's foundation had collapsed. What would happen to the other people attached to his system? Luonan was already unable to consider such a complicated problem. He was lucky enough to be able to analyze the situation before his eyes. But at this moment something unexpected popped up. The Wraith sign. This projection incarnation of the demon watched as the altar spiderweb that it was clinging to moved toward decay. Instead, it screamed noiselessly amidst the collapsing chaos. It was particularly excited, but it was unknown whether it was fear or joy. Or perhaps it was praise for the nature of chaos. This fellow. Luonan didn't understand. How did he suddenly notice the Wraith sign? How did he have the leisure to pay attention to such details? But it was precisely this leisure that drew out a bit of his extremely chaotic state of mind. It was like a sewer pipe that was stuffed full of filth. A gap suddenly burst open, but it didn't immediately clear up. Instead, Luonan heard a muffled echo. It was a faintly discernible rumble that soon became clear and distinct. Walala walala. Chapter 938. The Heavily Chained Crow. The materialization of the rules of formatting theory, My Heart's a Prison, was the embodiment of control and coercive power. It was also Luonan's original foundation. When Luonan's extraordinary power sprouted, it became the most special symbol. It was preserved at the very bottom. As Luonan's power level continued to rise, his accumulated techniques grew richer and richer. He rarely used the power of the heavily chained crow. At most, he used it to control the Wraith sign. And now, when everything was withering, decaying, and collapsing, the heavily chained crow appeared once more. It still maintained its fixed form. It still continued to maintain its rhythm and meaning. It still firmly locked the Wraith sign. No matter how deranged it was, it wouldn't cause a backlash. Luonan took in a long breath. His wildly beating heart seemed to be tied up by chains. From his perspective, it was better than nothing. The unchanging nature of the heavily chained crow was the most obvious lighthouse amidst the avalanche of chaos. It allowed him to have a bit of a sense of direction amidst the vast expanse of chaos. He wouldn't be completely lost. Such an effect was absolutely not an exaggeration to say that it was a cornerstone, a stabilizing needle. Why did it have this kind of effect? This scene felt a bit familiar. Luonan's consciousness drifted once more, but it was no longer a depraved loss of control. Instead, he used the manic Wraith sign and the stable heavily chained crow as primers. He made a reasonable association and completed a jump with a clear direction. Suddenly, a grand image appeared out of nowhere. No, this wasn't just an image. It was a complex movement that pierced through the barrier of space and time. It cut into the tree-hole space within the misty labyrinth. It connected with the lens and cast into the depths of the boundless sandstorm. It had a clear direction, and because its goal was clear, it quickly received a response. Luonan's consciousness broke free from the chaos. In the blink of an eye, it fell into an incomparably deep and grand world. Once again he saw the abyss sun wheel and the absolute chain prison clashing against each other. They kept each other in check and balance. The dazzling abyss sun wheel expanded and shrunk at times. Flames gushed out, transforming into tens of thousands of demons. The heavily chained crow crisscrossed layer upon layer, resonating with a howl. The humming sound was no different from last time. This included the flood of information hidden beneath this magnificent scene. Observation meant contact, connection, and conduction. In an instant, the grand image that was merely a silhouette of the vast spacetime was shattered. The violent and warped dynamic changes and the flood of information hidden deep within the changes burst forth once more. The flood of information surged toward Luo Nan. In the blink of an eye, the flood of information from the solar wheel extreme prison drowned his consciousness. Right now, Luo Nan's soul cloak had withered, and the altar's spiderweb had decayed. The buffer medium was no longer present. He was practically facing the onslaught of the flood head-on. However, he wasn't smashed to death in the water, because at that very moment, the chaotic, disorderly, and dirty elements of the sin poison almost filled up his consciousness. The waterway was already half filled up. If another wave of water rushed over, not only would it burst the dam, the front and back would also have to be stirred up. With this stir, a new change was stirred up. Both sides were in chaos, but chaos was different. A comparative thought popped up in Luo Nan's mind at this time. They were both warped and chaotic. The flood of information from the solar wheel extreme prison was just a large number of fragments of order and rules gathered together. There was something real inside. In comparison, the sin poison seemed more like a deliberate and malicious distortion. Luo Nan didn't know if his judgment was correct or not. However, the mixing of the two types of chaos was far more complex and intense than what he felt or imagined. The chaos still existed, but a powerful chemical reaction was clearly formed between them. It was so powerful that Luo Nan's consciousness turned into a mass of chaotic mist in the blink of an eye. It was impossible for Luo Nan to pry into the explosive details within unless he was truly tired of living. The only thing he could confirm was that there should be a relatively large-scale erosion or transformation between the two. This was because Luo Nan's current pitiful capacity of bearing or depth did not cause his head to explode in an instant. Instead, it was as if he was being brushed by water vapor within the pervasive chaotic mist. It was warm, it was cool, of course he would still swell and he would still get hurt. Luo Nan felt that he had grown a size fatter. He seemed to have become cumbersome. This was the reaction of the substantial pressure on the mental plane sinking down to his bones. However, the boundary between pain and comfort was blurred under this bizarre situation. It was hard for him to assess the severity of his injuries. Actually, it was meaningless. If he couldn't get through this, the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military drill manual would clearly state what would happen to him under the heavy contamination of the sin poison. Should I just wait foolishly in the primal chaos? Luo Nan just had this thought when he discovered the extremely excited wraith sign within the primal chaos. There was also the image of the heavily chained crow that connected him to the wraith sign. In a certain sense, the two could be considered as Luo Nan's perceptual tentacles. He could use them to sense the inside and outside. Their existences gave Luo Nan an additional sense of existence within the primal chaos. Existence itself was order. Moreover, it was order that Luo Nan could sense, control, and extend. Luo Nan was dazed for a moment. He looked at the two existences that maintained an extremely strong sense of existence within the primal chaos. The associative route that he had projected earlier was reversed. From the majestic solar wheel extreme prison to the wraith sign and the heavily chained crow. The wraith sign was the projection of the abyssal sun wheel. The heavily chained crow was the reflection of the extreme prison. Since this was the case, why didn't the relationship and structure of the two be projected from the solar wheel extreme prison? No, they were originally like this. I just didn't understand it. As soon as this thought was born, the wraith sign suddenly let out a soundless hiss. Its ugly form collapsed into a shadow of nothingness. Soon, a demonic red light seeped out from within. The color of the light vaguely resembled the flames of the abyss sun wheel. The heavily chained crow also changed. It began to divide. 1 became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 8. It wrapped around the glowing wraith sign. Relatively speaking, the chain after division was a bit more nothingness. But in Luo Nan's eyes, the interweaving and disorderly structure possessed a more substantial configuration meaning than when it was a single chain. In the blink of an eye, a miniature solar wheel extreme prison appeared on the plane of Luo Nan's consciousness. In terms of vastness and boundlessness, it was like heaven and earth when compared to the main body. In terms of subtlety and profoundness, it was unattainable when compared to the main body. But it was similar. It wasn't similar in a simple sense. Instead, it was a projection and mapping in terms of structural rules and functional relationships. Especially when Luonan's consciousness was cast over, some minor discordant details began to rapidly adjust and mend. There was Luonan's aesthetic perception within, and there was also a kind of attractive force. From Luonan's submerged memories, and from the currently pervading primal chaos mist, the Wraith sign gathered relevant rules and information, continuously perfecting them. A red glow gradually seeped out from the primal chaos. Chapter 939. The red light illuminated a portion of the area, helping Luonan see order within the chaos. At the very least, he could try to understand what the internal conflict was like within the chaotic mist that pervaded the entire plane of consciousness. The heavily chained crow and the Wraith sign were, of course, Luonan himself. They were located at the center of the chaotic mist. They made an elementary imitation of the imagery and laws of Sunwheel Extreme Prison. Actually, they actively guided the power of Sunwheel Extreme Prison to cross space and resist the corruption of sinful poison. Regardless of whether Luonan did it intentionally or not, this was an established fact. It was impossible for Luonan to utilize the power of Sunwheel Extreme Prison, especially the roaring torrent of information, to cleanse the universe in one fell swoop with Luonan's control and analytical abilities. But when the primal chaos fog collided, a strange feeling gradually appeared. The filthy curtain that seemed to be rooted in Luonan's memories was washed back and forth by the torrent of information from Sunwheel Extreme Prison. It was warped by an even more powerful power of distortion, to the point of being washed away. Though it still looked the same, Luonan became more and more familiar with it the more he looked at it. Luonan repeated the familiarity over and over again. It was like staring at a character and looking at it hundreds of times. Suddenly it became unfamiliar. In reality, this was a kind of semantic saturation phenomenon. After the brain received the same stimulation over and over again, it produced a nervous fatigue that caused it to enter a state of inhibition. Luonan's current situation was pretty much the same. His brain nerves were far more than tired under the violent flood of information. They were simply overworked. With sinful poison as the central axis of stimulation, it gave him continuous attacks. If it were anyone else, they would have long since gone insane, gone mad, and their body and soul would have collapsed. However, Luonan had a layer of chaotic mist as a buffer. He forcefully withstood over 100 waves of attacks, holding on to the point of nervous suppression. His ability to distinguish and associate dropped substantially. He was unable to absorb the destructive power of sinful poison's law distortion. He could only pay attention to a portion of its structure. The problem was, when he looked at it this way, why did he feel that the other side was more handsome? Suddenly, Luonan discovered a new world. The environment of laws created by sinful poison was admittedly chaotic to the extreme, but it seemed that it could be disassembled. His analytical ability hadn't reached the level where he could immediately see through the mysteries. However, there was a trend that the heavily chained crow and the Wraith sign, which already possessed some kind of highly integrated ability, especially the structure of this Sunwheel Extreme Hell, that they imitated, only needed an inducement to be effective. When Luonan muddle-headedly swept his eyes over the specious fragments contained within the sin poison, the Sunwheel Extreme Prison had already taken the first step. Part of the evil poison had been broken down. At least that was what Luonan saw. Luonan was still not too clear on the fundamental framework for the birth and existence of sin poison. However, he was still able to understand the parts of sin poison that had been stripped away by the scouring and collision. Luonan saw that the fragments that had been torn apart originally had their own source and flow of laws. It was just that the portions that had suffered deliberate distortions were stripped off one after another and precipitated. Some of them even realized a return to normal, turning into law fragments. They attached themselves to the heavily chained crow and gradually fused with it. As for the inexplicable and pure chaotic parts, after they were extracted, they were swallowed up by the miniature sunwheel formed by the Wraith sign and burned fiercely as fuel. Of course, the sin poison that filled one's vision and filled one's soul wasn't something that could be easily digested. The conflict between the Sunwheel Extreme Prison and the evil poison continued. It was very likely that this conflict would continue for a long time. The mist of primal chaos was still growing endlessly, continuing to give Luonan immense pressure. However, things always developed in a good direction, right? Luonan watched for a long time, but the phenomenon of semantic saturation did not occur again. Instead, he gained more insight into the combined architectural pattern manifested by the continued decomposition of the evil poison. It didn't seem like a misconception. Luonan's fingers subconsciously twitched twice. It was with great difficulty that he was able to restrain the impulse to draw a diagram out of thin air. As expected, I'm still a person on the side of order. Luonan knew that he had retreated from the edge of the cliff once more to be able to have this leisure. And because of this, true pleasure, the kind that could be controlled, was like a sweet spring that overflowed from the cracks in his heart. It rapidly healed the wounds that were on the verge of collapse. Only now did Luonan discover that his entire body was drenched in cold sweat. His mental state was quite good. Perhaps the saying, when things reach an extreme, they will move in the opposite direction, really made a bit of sense. After a round of conflict, he had actually recovered a bit from his extreme weakness. He looked at Snake Tongue. The evil poison could be contagious, and it could be contagious in her current state. Snake Tongue's complexion wasn't as pale as before. However, she had been acting as Luonan's test subject for the past few days. Her energy was lacking, and now she encountered this matter. She was caught in the crossfire, and she was in a worse state than Luonan. Her back could no longer support itself. She couldn't straighten her body. She was half lying on the ground on the verge of collapse. Luonan couldn't help but feel a bit guilty when he saw her appearance. He got up and walked over. He asked warmly, "Are you feeling a bit better?" Snake Tongue heard this and forcefully propped her body up. Luonan was both admiring and a bit amused when he saw her appearance. "I'm afraid your luck has been exhausted up in the clouds. These days really haven't been easy. People always lacked self-awareness in times like this." Snake Tongue's eyes were half closed, and her pupils tilted to the side. She did her best to keep her voice steady and not trembling. "I've disturbed my lord's ocular technique cultivation. It's my fault." "What cultivation? Ocular technique?" Luonan was startled with a laugh. He suddenly had some thoughts. He pointed at his eyes. "Here." Fortunately, Snake Tongue was able to understand his meaning. Her eyelids drooped and she spoke in a soft voice, "My lord's divine ability." Luonan only knew that Snake Tongue had been infected by him, but he didn't have the time to review the channel of infection. If it was really as Snake Tongue said, then he could transmit the evil poison with just his eyes, causing the target to be contaminated. This really could be considered a type of ocular technique. Was his brain still sluggish? It wasn't easy for him to calm down, and now he had the guts to use the evil poison? The heavily chained crow and the new version of the wraith sign structure must have made him arrogant. Luonan really wanted to knock himself on the head and let his reason occupy a high position once more. But this thought was born and his mind was like a cat scratching at it. He had glimpsed some of the outline of the structure during the partial decomposition of the evil poison. The outline transformed into abstract lines that danced in his mind. His fingers twitched more and more fiercely. Luckily, Luonan didn't have the time to ponder this deeply. The distant signal was transferred and received by the external neuron. Zhang Yingying's voice came roaring over, "What the hell is going on?" There was a bang, and the signal disappeared. The ground was covered in mercury. "I nearly called the police, you scum." Hearing this, Luonan's smile, which had just calmed down, surged up once more. It carried a few absurd emotions of déjà vu, but these emotions were already real and controllable. Only now did Luonan truly feel the force field of the real world gently covering his body. He really had come out from the game setting. Even though he had been smuggled in by the evil poison, he could still see it. He was still alive, right? Luonan really wanted to say thank you to his grandfather. Thank you to his grandfather. It was his notebook that had laid down such an indestructible foundation for him. Of course, he also needed to thank the Sunwheel Hell in the distant deep space. Luonan was becoming more and more convinced that it was very likely that it was the true source of formatting theory's power. "Are you going crazy again? Speaking of which, we're going to land in 2 hours. Are you coming or not?" "I'm coming. Of course I'm coming." Luonan blurted out. He looked through the cabin's porthole to look at the color of the sky outside. He saw the sunset filling the sky. He looked at his watch again. It was already 6 o'clock in the evening in Ban City. Before he went to sleep, Zhang Yingying had told him the time. It was approximately 10:30 in the morning in Xia City. Ban City was an hour ahead of Xia City. This meant that he had slept for approximately 7 hours. And in the game setting, a total of at least 70 hours had passed. In other words, the difference in the flow of time had reached 10 times. It looked like he had profited, and it was a huge profit. The amount of time he could control, or even his lifespan, had been extended by 10 times in an instant. But Luonan pondered it carefully, especially when he looked at his own state, and he had some doubts. His soul strength was empty. His soul cloak had collapsed. The altar's spiderweb had decayed. Admittedly, these things could be regenerated, but for them to grow to such a scale was the result of Luo Nan's accumulation over the past few months. He had squeezed them dry in a short 7 hours. This sort of consumption made Luo Nan feel rather uneasy. There was also the uninvited evil poison. Even though it had been suppressed and a portion of it had been dealt with, could there really be no repercussions for existences on the plane of laws? Let's not talk about the excessively fictitious ones. There was the most realistic one. Luo Nan had just promised Zhang Yingying that he would go meet up with them. Let's not talk about the real person. Even if it was his water vapor avatar, his soul cloak had collapsed. It was hard to avoid having to rack his brain again. Another period of awkward blankness passed. Zhang Yingying was convinced. Hello. You went on a mental journey again. Did you save the world in your dream? Did you win or lose? Say something. I nearly destroyed the world, it's true. Luo Nan responded with sincerity. He ignored Zhang Yingying's laughter and curses for the time being. He looked into the mental plane and grasped his own state. He began to seriously consider a plan to remedy the situation. It was strange. According to Luo Nan's usual way of thinking, he should be thinking in the direction of the mental plane, the soul cloak, the polar region of the abyss, and so on. He had done this before, and he had long since become familiar with it. But right now, the above directions and plans only ran through his mind, and he was unable to raise any interest. Admittedly, part of this was due to Luo Nan's large amount of soul strength and the accumulation of his framework being annihilated in a puff of smoke. But there was an even greater factor. Luo Nan felt that there wasn't much technical content. Speaking of which, Luo Nan had spent 70 hours in the game setting. He had already fiercely raised the aesthetic level of the configuration design and application. Yes, the Heavenly Yuan Empire didn't have a purely mental configuration application. But the strict, systematic and highly efficient configuration model was deep and enchanting. Once one touched upon the basics and experienced the richness of its contents, one would be unable to stop. Hello? Hello. Luo Yuan, why this attitude of yours won't do. Luo Nan's soul was called back by Zhang Yingying. But this allowed his pure aesthetic impulse to take the upper hand. He responded with a sound and then smeared honey on his mouth. Sister Yingying, I want to ask you something. Do you have any processing tools over at the airship? Do you have a fever? Chapter 940. This request isn't excessive, right? I just need to process a very small item. The precision requirement is just SOSO. Luo Nan's tone weakened as he spoke. He thought about it from another perspective. It really was excessive. Her Majesty Empress Wu's private airship wasn't an Earth patroller. All sorts of equipment and accessories were readily available. They could be processed and repaired at any time and any place. Luo Nan's way of thinking was still stuck in the game setting. Cough. The previous plan didn't work. Then, what do you want to process? Zhang Yingying suddenly asked him. There was a subtle change in her voice. It became much more reserved and proper. Though Luo Nan couldn't see the situation on the other side, he naturally followed the attitude of the other side and gave a more detailed introduction. This is a small tool called the syncopator. Its main purpose is to act as a medium for soul strength, to establish a relatively sealed interference environment. It has a prescribed shape. It isn't complicated. With a mold, it can be mass-produced. Are there any requirements for the materials? Well, it would be best if there were shape memory alloys with high fatigue resistance. There are similar products on the market. I've seen them here in Ban City. It's fine if there aren't any. I've also considered ordinary magnesium aluminum carbon alloys, mutant skeletons. Will water crystals work? Boss said that she can help, but the materials are certainly not enough. Mechanical creations can't do it, but we can use the condensation ring to create high-strength water crystals. Why? Her Majesty Empress Wu? Luo Nan was shocked, but he quickly reacted. He slapped his thigh and said, yes. Of course it's possible. This is a consumable item. In terms of plasticity, the chemical bonds. It needs a few more forms. I'll take care of this on the blueprint. In the end, Luo Nan remembered Her Majesty Empress Wu's identity. It wasn't good for her to waste time looking for a solution. He decided to do his own homework. Speaking of which, Luo Nan really did diligently research in the game setting. He studied how to use Earth's current technological conditions to reproduce the problem of the syncopator after returning to reality. He took some time out of his busy schedule to look up and download quite a bit of information. He even made a plan. The Syncopator was famous for being easy to learn, easy to use, and low in cost. It had a wide range of applications and the information was extremely large. Among them, many of them were based on the experiences of surviving in the wilderness or fleeing for their lives, using materials from the ground and improvising on the spot. But the specific details? Hiss. Suddenly, electricity passed through Luo Nan's brain. There really was electricity. The external neuron coiled in the depths of Luo Nan's brain was radiating electricity at this moment, manifesting its existence. The sizable flow of information poured into Luo Nan's perceptual plane in this form. It formed images, scenes, blueprints, and words that quickly flipped through. The vast majority of them were extremely familiar, and they were highly related to the problem of the centometer that Luo Nan was currently pondering over. Luo Nan even saw the contents of the fantasy mimicry skill chip given to him by Lieutenant Go Yi. Luo Nan's mind was in a trance. He heard Zhang Yingying urging him on the blueprints. Luo Nan responded as he used the external neuron search and organize function to comb through the flow of information. There were keywords such as syncopator, ice, structure, and other keywords in his mind. The corresponding solutions were simply queuing up to jump out of his mind. It was so comfortable. Luo Nan studied and worked within the game scene. This was the state he was in. It wasn't some great invention that would shock the heavens and make the gods weep. The predecessors had researched it and formed a system. How delightful it was to use it on the spot. This was much better than tormenting and fumbling in the mental domain by himself. He had many mature solutions as a reference. He made fine adjustments to the design on this basis. His train of thought flowed smoothly, and he finished the draft after chatting with Zhang Yingying for a bit. I just sent it over. Zhang Yingying laughed. Don't be a scribble. The boss doesn't have the leisure to read your psychic drawing. Zhang Yingying didn't say anything after that. 7 or 8 seconds passed before Luo Nan couldn't help but ask her, is there a problem? Zhang Yingying went, yeah. Then she corrected him, no. I mean, what's this called again? It's the centometer, big sis. Zhang Yingying wasn't annoyed. She simply evaluated, it seems quite interesting. She paused for a moment before letting out an emotional sigh. Speaking of which, this is the first time I've been able to understand a drawing you've drawn. It's not that I understand it. I just have a general understanding of the flow. The portrait doesn't count. Is that a compliment? Of course. It's not just me. You can go ask Bamboo Pole and the others. In the past, you were like a heavenly steed soaring into the sky. In times like this, either we're idiots or you're mentally ill. Choose one of the two. Which one do you choose? Luo Nan decisively chose neither. Zhang Yingying didn't know what sort of resources Luo Nan had used to complete the centometer blueprint. She didn't know how many circles Luo Nan had gone in. She had a misunderstanding that wasn't too big nor too small. She asked casually, did you rely on this to realize your water vapor clone? There's a bit of a difference. I definitely need this right now. I understand. The small misunderstanding didn't affect Zhang Yingying's ability to understand. I'll give it to the boss right away. Don't worry. With my understanding of the boss, a toy of this level isn't a problem. All right. Thank Her Majesty Empress Wu on my behalf. Luo Nan didn't know if Her Majesty Empress Wu was by Zhang Yingying's side right now, but he still had to say what needed to be said. He reminded her in the end, notify me when you're done. There's still the assembly segment. I'll need your help then. No problem. You don't need to worry about time. At most, I'll notify the cockpit and have them circle around the Pacific Ocean a few more times. Oh my, I owe you a favor. It's good that you know. Go on your knees. Go. Luo Nan really wasn't good at being talkative. He could only retreat in defeat. But speaking a few more words always made his mood a bit better. He laughed as he hung up the call, but he soon restrained himself a bit. Her Majesty Empress Wu's face flashed before his eyes. It was uncertain. Luo Nan pondered for a moment and tossed these thoughts to the back of his mind for the time being. He contacted Yin Lu again. Yes, this was done through the external neuron adapter wristband. Yin Lu clearly wasn't used to this sort of method. She asked probingly, Mister? Where are you? I'm on the front deck. I'll be right there. Okay, no need. I'll send you a set of blueprints. Give it to the Master Guard and have them work on it as soon as possible. The materials are divided into 2 types, skeletons and metals. We need 2 of each. No 4 base numbers. The specific number and requirements are all written on it. At this moment, Luonan thought of the external module of the Frozen Alive installation. He learned from the previous example of a shortage of syncopators, so he casually doubled the number. Yinlu had just responded when Luonan said, "There's also T-City. It's more convenient for you to make arrangements. Prepare some as well." T-City? Ah yes. Is the same number okay? It's enough. Luonan didn't want to bother Her Majesty Empress Wu too much. Moreover, the materials for the water crystal were worrisome based on the data. Luonan could only deal with it temporarily. In the end, he needed to return to a mature material plan. After giving these instructions, Luonan casually asked, "How's the situation over at T-City?" Chapter 941. Luonan was just speaking casually, but Yinlu didn't dare to take it lightly. She immediately said, "I was just about to report to you. After Cadman was crippled, some changes have occurred in T-City. Currently, the Blood Flame Order that Yinlu was managing was in an extremely complicated situation. Cadman's fall had created a huge power vacuum in the T-City local faction of the Blood Flame Order. It was the perfect time for the Xia City headquarters faction to fill the vacuum. But at the same time, Mrs. Halder's whereabouts were unknown. Yinlu, who held the power on behalf of the Blood Flame Order, was thousands of kilometers away. The Xia City headquarters faction was more or less slow in their response. After losing Cadman, the local tyrant, the Blood Flame Order would become an outsider in D-City's territory. They would definitely have to face the retaliation of the local forces, and this local was not just the Blood Flame Order's internal structure. Luonan wasn't good at this kind of thing, but as the new boss of the Blood Flame Order, he had to show some concern. "I remember that T-City has a lot of power?" "Yes. T-City has military, political, business, and religion. It's quite prosperous as well. It's one of the core offices of the world government, a famous paradise for sea explorers, and an important trading center for mutated goods. The power of the secular world is very strong. The number of ability users from the inner world, especially those who have registered with the society, will explode at any time. Some powerful people are willing to stay there for a long time. In terms of prosperity, it's top-notch." Luonan understood what Yinlu was implying. The distribution is complicated and they keep each other in check. No wonder you chose T-City. They're just struggling to survive. Yinlu gave a small compliment. "It's all thanks to you being here that many people have dispelled their thoughts. Everyone is just watching from the other side of the river. It's an impromptu action." With Luonan's limited political wisdom, he could guess that the reason why the powerful local faction of T-City hadn't made a move yet was because they were afraid of Mr. Mo's powerful suppressive power. They couldn't interfere. Furthermore, the important meeting named Auction on the Sea, which was also known as New Plane Scouting Meeting, was about to begin. The real major forces were in a tacit state of silence. What's more, they didn't know that Luonan, who was playing the role of Mr. Mo, had exhausted his strength from playing games. It would be quite difficult for him to exert his strength from a distance and intimidate the entire world in a short amount of time. Needless to say, as long as he was beaten to a pulp by the true gods and Pope of the Amaterasu cult, the situation in D-City would definitely change again. It was probably because he had jumped out of the chess game for a period of time. His mind was empty and Luonan reflected on his own actions. "You guys should be having a headache over me being too high profile. It would be fine if the church was one of the big three, but it's not. In this case, it's hard to say whether it's a blessing or a curse." Yinlu paused for a moment but quickly said, "What's the difference between the Blood Flame Order and Mr.? Even your madam can't afford to say that. In such a situation, if Madame Halder were to step forward, given her current level of power, be it in terms of intimidation or authority, it would be the best for the Blood Flame Order. But did she stand up for him? It had been over 10 days since he killed Gong Qi, but there was still no movement from that side. His injuries were too severe, and he needed time to regenerate his flesh and blood? That's not right. The situation over there could be hidden from anyone, but it could not be hidden from Luonan. Was it a hidden pawn plotting a grand scheme? Or was it purely emptiness? It was said that many people would be dominated by a so-called feeling of emptiness for a period of time after they completed a certain long-term goal. Unfortunately, Luonan was unable to empathize with them. As he continued to advance in the process of opening up formatting theory, the resources he grasped continued to accumulate. Inexplicably, his enemies grew more and more numerous. They filled the entire world. Right now he didn't even need to use his own motivation. There were naturally people who forced him forward. In the eyes of many people, his behavior was relatively easy to predict. Madame Halder was different. In a certain sense, Luo Nan could dominate Madame Halder, but he was still unable to understand her thoughts. Complicated. Truly complicated. In comparison, there were also life and death trials. Being a maintenance soldier in the game scene was far simpler. Yinlu didn't know Luo Nan's current situation and mentality, but she knew what Luo Nan was most concerned about. She felt that the topic of the Order's governance and survival wasn't suitable to continue, so she changed the topic. According to your arrangements, Mr., the preparations for the guidance ritual have been completed. If Mr. needs it, we can begin testing at any time. Oh, you're ready? Of course Luo Nan remembered that he had arranged for Yinlu to prepare ahead of time. He would guide the believers of the Blood Flame Order into the virtual world of the Innerverse Simulator to conduct internal testing. Just like Snake Tongue. But he never expected that he would be one step ahead of her. He would experience an unimaginably deep level of depth. His thoughts naturally drifted toward the Blood Soul Temple in the Abyss District. He looked at the relevant arrangements. His soul strength had shrunk greatly. Although he could still sense the various believers as well as the targets he controlled directly and indirectly, it was more like pulling a kite string. The precision of his senses had decreased. Let's leave it at that for now. I'll let you know if there are any areas that need to be fixed. Luo Nan didn't rashly spit out his approval. Putting aside his unexpected circumstances, Snake Tongue's experience showed that internal testing was not an easy matter. It involved hundreds and thousands of core believers of the Blood Flame Order. One could never be too careful. Plus, everything could only be carried out after the Innerverse Simulator was rebooted. Luo Nan unconsciously sighed after hanging up. Time passed by the minute and second. The virtual plane that he hoped to bring out had yet to truly begin. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't anxious. Fortunately, from the game scene, Luo Nan was more willing to say that he had obtained a large amount of knowledge and experience from the Vanguard Planet No. 4 relay station. It had diluted his anxious mood to a large degree. He even had the mood to consider. It was admittedly convenient to guide the believers of the Blood Flame Order through a ritual to converge their thoughts. But the collective model that he had seen so far wasn't considered too brilliant, especially when compared to the Heavenly Yuan Empire's military. But the environments of the two were different. Their natures weren't quite the same. Even if he wanted to improve it, there should be some differences from a standard array, but the more he thought, the more complicated things became. His mood, which had just eased up, tensed up once more. He had just returned to the spacetime of Earth, but countless problems were already entangling him. If he wanted to complete every branch perfectly and flawlessly, then his brain would really explode. Unfortunately, this was reality. Luo Nan had to think of a way to coordinate and utilize every bit of power when facing an opponent whose strength was above his, as well as a large number of potential enemies. This was a completely different concept from when he was a small and insignificant maintenance soldier who obeyed orders in the relay station. Luo Nan shook his head and sat back on the tatame. He wanted to empty his mind, but then he heard familiar footsteps outside the cabin at this time. He didn't know why Yinlu, who had just ended the call, had come over. Mr. Come in. Yinlu swept a glance at Snake Tongue out of habit after entering the room. She was a bit used to seeing this person's terrible state. Perhaps this person and Luo Nan were fated to clash? Yinlu's gaze turned to Luo Nan. She was just about to speak when she was startled. She couldn't say what she was feeling. In short, there were some changes compared to when they spoke in the morning. Luo Nan had just sent the syncopator blueprints over. He saw her appearance and found it quite strange. Is something the matter? Yinlu hurriedly calmed her mind and lowered her head. I just contacted Master Shou. I've already sent the syncopator blueprints over. But Master Shou specifically mentioned that he wants to see you. He said that there are two matters. The first is to inquire about the usage of the second version of the exoskeleton frame. Well, I haven't had the time to try it out yet. Luo Nan's gaze shot to a corner of the cabin. There were 3 metal boxes placed side by side. Yinlu's previous arrangement was still the same as before. I've also spoken to Master Shou about this, but he mentioned that his partner, Mrs. Jianghu, also wants to meet with you, Mr. Jianghu. She's the technical director of the Great Marsh Processing Factory. Luo Nan interrupted Yinlu's words. I know this person. She was among the people that Goda Masayoshi kidnapped that day. Luo Nan's memories flipped to the figure of that woman as he spoke. Most of the time she was a quiet and low-key woman. She wasn't too eye-catching. Don't forget that Luonan spent most of his energy on the distant confrontation with the Pope and the true God. He also spent his energy on the high-level conference of the inner world that was convened at the same time. For him to be able to notice this person under those circumstances proved that this person possessed some sort of attractive quality that attracted his psychic senses. Or perhaps replacing the word quality with inharmonious or doubtful point wouldn't be a problem. Luonan ran through the image of Jianghu in his mind and asked Yin Lu, "Did she say why she came looking for you?" Yin Lu shook her head slightly. Master Shou didn't speak in detail. He just said that she's a partner who advances and retreats together. She came to pay a visit. Normally Yin Lu could refuse, but she clearly understood that the veteran held a rather high position in Luonan's heart. There was no need to offend him for this sort of thing. Sure enough, Luonan didn't refuse. "Okay. I have to give Master Shou face. Let her come." "Let them come to the yacht?" Luonan looked around. "This place is pretty good. It's just outside in the living room. We can talk about the exoskeleton frame and the matter of the syncopator. It saves us the trouble of moving things around. Alright, if it's convenient for Master Shou, let him bring over some processed skeletons." Yin Lu bowed. Seeing that Luonan didn't have any further requests, she withdrew from the bedroom and went to make arrangements. Luonan looked at Snake Tongue. He saw that it would be hard for her to recover in a short time, so he didn't pay any more attention to her. He thought for a bit and walked to the location where the metal boxes were placed. He randomly picked one, placed it flat on the ground and opened the lock. The space inside was opened up, and the exoskeleton frame, which was folded in a special manner, slowly stood up with a slow rhythm, revealing its complete structure. The toughness of the ox-ghost skeletons and the shape memory function formed after first-rate processing were fully displayed. Luonan had his eyes on this point, so he let the veteran take charge of the syncopator production. This was the second version of the exoskeleton frame. It was designed before Luonan contended with the two powerful members of the Amaterasu order. Later on, Luonan redesigned the third version based on the injuries he received after the battle. Every design was an improvement. The improvement was just a bit too fast, so much so that the results of his thinking far exceeded the material supply. Hiss! Luonan suddenly sucked in a long breath. His reaction was a bit big. Even Snake Tongue, who was behind him, raised her head to look over. She saw Luonan smack his fist against his palm. He said hatefully, "It's getting rough again." Chapter 942. When Old Hand and Jianghu stepped into the living room on the deck, they saw that the place had completely transformed into a workshop. On that day Mr. Emo, who was thousands of miles away, had completely unfurled the 3 second edition exoskeleton frames while they were chatting and laughing merrily by the lakeside. One was placed in front of him. One was draped over his body. On the tatami mats and the table there was a torn piece of clothing. The virtual work area had a rough outline of a structural design, as well as the sketches of various spare parts, modules, and so on. Aside from the main frame, everything else was switching at high speeds. It was a dazzling sight. Mr. Emo himself appeared to be relatively calm. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, sat cross-legged, and gazed at the virtual work area. He didn't make any movements, but his eyeballs would occasionally swivel. You should be thinking. Jianghu's gaze couldn't help but look around the living room, which had practically lost its ability to receive guests. Only then did he cast an inquiring gaze toward Old Hand. What he meant was, "Is this Mr. Emo like this in private?" Old Hand nodded imperceptibly. At the very least, when they interacted normally, they mainly discussed technology and researched. Of course, perhaps he simply treated you as a technician. There was no need to bicker with you in other fields. Mr. Emo was extremely focused. He didn't pay attention to the two. Yin Lu, who had led them in, was not surprised by this sort of scene. She calmly found a place where she could stand and invited Old Hand and Jianghu to take their seats. Since she still had matters to attend to, she excused herself and Mr. Emo left. Snake Tongue played the role of a maid. She offered short tables, tea, desserts, and so on to the two of them. Her attitude was humble and her standards were rather high. She made up for Mr. Mo's arrogance that came from being overly focused. The two of them were somewhat overwhelmed by the favor. When they were seated, Jianghu sensed that Mr. Mo's current attitude was a bit different from what he expected. He furrowed his brows as he pondered on how to cut in. As for Old Hand, he adapted to this situation much earlier than Jianghu. He took a sip of tea, took out the bone material requested, and placed it on the short table. Snake Tongue came over on her own, took it and sent it over to Luo Nan. After that, the veteran looked around the living room, especially the situation of the 3 exoskeletons in the living room. He tried to find clues in Mr. Mo's train of thought to prepare for future processing and adjustments. The first thing he noticed was a very strange detail. From his angle, he could see that Mr. Mo's body was actually in a semi-suspended state. He was supported by the exoskeleton frame, and there was a distance of nearly 10 centimeters between him and the tatami below. Looking at it in detail, the exoskeleton frame that was half hidden in the shadow of Luo Nan's body did not appear to be a stable and firm structure. Instead, it was in the midst of constant change. In front of him was the lower ring-shaped frame, and a second later, it turned into a drooping arm support joint. Next, it might be the half-disassembled load-bearing unit of the spine. Sometimes even the veteran couldn't clearly see what it was. The only thing he could confirm was that these supporting points were all parts of the exoskeleton frame. They were under Mr. Mo's control, constantly mobilizing and adjusting. They were in a highly active state. Of course, the exoskeleton frame itself had a relatively fixed form. No matter how active it was, there was a limit. The changes had a boundary. And during the process of active switching, the frame would occasionally sway and lose balance. However, Mr. Mo was always able to quickly find a balance. Even if there was only a sharp point of contact and the position was not in the center of gravity, it didn't stump him. The veteran seemed to understand something as he watched this scene. Mr. Mo opened his mouth to speak at this time. The balance test can be considered a good way to examine the physical structure of the exoskeleton system. It's simple and easy to use. It's not expensive. The veteran had already entered a state of mind. He leaned forward slightly and asked, "Then, do you think there are any problems with this version? I see that you've always been testing the flexibility of the mimicry changes. Is there a problem?" The problem isn't small. Luo Nan wore Mr. Mo's face and faced the cautious face of the veteran. He grinned and said, "But this is my problem. It's the problem of my eyes suddenly becoming sharper and sharper." In the eyes of the current Luo Nan, or to be exact, in the eyes of the Luo Nan who had gone through 70 hours of high-intensity training as a maintenance soldier in the repeater station of Planet Vanguard 4 and lived in actual combat, regardless of whether it was the second version that already possessed the actual object or the third version that was still in the state of a blueprint, the overall idea was that the mimicry transformation was the main functional requirement. It was possible to use it as an auxiliary line and mounting module to construct a perfect body. But there were far too many unsatisfactory areas on the level of detail. All the problems could be summed up in one point: crude. Too crude. The exoskeleton frame before Luo Nan's eyes had practically every design, every structure, every module, every accessory, and even the operational logic. It could be found in the enormous and rigorous creation system of the Heavenly Yuan Empire. Moreover, it was a more perfect and mature plan. Actually, there was no need to flip through the database. Luo Nan had experienced the most commonly used classical structures under his high-intensity training. They far surpassed the exoskeleton in terms of stability and reliability. Even if there were material limitations and a certain degree of incomparability, the difference between the two was as great as the distance between Vanguard 4 and the Crimson Will Rift from the perspective of pure design philosophy. It didn't need to cross galaxies, but it should be measured in light years. Luo Nan's state of mind was quite good. He even patiently explained to the veteran, "The design of the actual object and the design of the configuration are different. This is an old truth, right? The problem is that I looked at it too shallowly before. Sinking from the configuration to the material plane and then completing the corresponding design of the actual object. There really is an enormous amount of knowledge involved." For example, instructor Xing Zhan of the repeater station. Half of his reputation as a master was bestowed upon him by his achievements in the sinking stage. This was an area that Luo Nan wasn't good at. The more ideal his configuration design was, the more eye-catching the whimsical aspects of the actual object's design would be. The majority of the reason why he was able to reach the standards of the second and third versions was the result of Dean Wan's forceful correction and leveling. Luo Nan had a general idea of this before, but there were many times when he couldn't change it. Now that he had the blessings of a maintenance soldier at the repeater station, he understood it even more clearly. He also had a clearer direction. Time was very tight. Wasting time was very shameful. But as long as there was a direction, everything was acceptable. Let's talk about the changes to the fourth version first. Why is it the fourth version? is because the third version is dead in my mind. Luo Nan laughed out loud, proving that his mood was quite good. Part of it was to pacify the overly nervous mind of the veteran. The conflict by the lakeshore and the unforeseen changes in the background would more or less have an impact on them. Luo Nan had to take care of the veteran, who was friends with his grandfather, the veteran of the Hengduan 7 tribes. The veteran relaxed a bit, but he didn't dare to treat Luo Nan lightly. He turned on the recording function of his wristband and listened attentively. At this time Jianghu gave a slight bow and spoke softly, "Apologies. I'm going to the restroom." This was clearly to avoid arousing suspicion. Luo Nan didn't mind at first, but Jianghu had the intention. He wouldn't refuse, so he nodded. Snake Tongue understood and went forward to greet him. Jianghu had already stood up by now. He turned around and politely thanked Luo Nan before following Snake Tongue. A woman's time in the restroom could always be easily adjusted. She could look at herself in the mirror and touch up her makeup. It wasn't a problem for her to go from 5 minutes to 50 minutes. However, Jianghu wasn't someone who was used to carrying cosmetics on her. She had come here today because she had heard the news from the veteran. The two of them directly left the workplace. She was only wearing her everyday light clothes. In the eyes of some people this was already quite rude. Jianghu just washed her face and stared blankly into the mirror. Several droplets of water splashed onto the surface of the mirror, reflecting an ordinary and intellectual face. Her eyes were dazed for a moment. Only then did he recognize that it was him. His fingers slid down from his cheeks, slowly moving to his neck, and then along his collarbone to his shoulder. On his thin and slightly stiff shoulder, he could feel the texture of the fabric, but there was also an additional force silently pulsating there. A rhythmic knocking sounded on the door. Jianghu instantly came back to reality. He hastily wiped away the remaining droplets of water on his cheeks, adjusted his breathing and opened the door. He spoke to Snake Tongue at the door. "Apologies. I've kept you waiting." Snake Tongue bowed slightly. She was still like a dutiful maid. However, the words that flowed from her lips and teeth at this moment had more or less surpassed her status. "Mrs. Jiang is quite familiar with the layout of this place." Jianghu was a bit startled. He immediately replied, "It's because this yacht used to be under Mr. Matsudaira's name. I've come here a few times." "Yes, Mr. Matsudaira Yoshio is Mrs. Jiang's investor. Have the two of you known each other for a long time?" "Yes, quite a long time." Jianghu unconsciously sighed as he spoke. "It looks like this is a story related to friendship." "I spoke too much for a moment. Customer, please don't mind." Snake Tongue didn't say anything else. She took small, traditional steps and raised her hand to lead the way for Jianghu. Soon the two of them returned to the messy living room. Luo Nan and the veteran were already nearing the end of their conversation. "I need to finalize it within 6 hours. I know this isn't easy, but I still need to do it. Just like before, I'll first build a test machine. I'll pile one up regardless of the cost." Luo Nan really did have an urgent need for an exoskeleton frame. After all, the perfect body was the prerequisite for his current strongest state. Especially since his soul strength had been completely consumed and needed time to replenish, he needed to be by his side at all times. 6 hours. 6 hours it is. The veteran didn't know what sort of environment Luo Nan was in after he delivered the 3 exoskeleton frame version 2 equipment. He didn't know what sort of life Luo Nan had lived through, nor did he know what sort of challenges he would face in the future. But as he communicated with Mr. Imo, he gradually discovered that the small tacit understanding he had built up with Mr. Imo over the past few days was torn apart. He needed to wring his almost dry brain to squeeze out more nutrients to keep up with the pace of this powerful and mysterious client. His expression was a bit bitter right now, but the toughness he had polished in the wilderness prevailed. He gritted his teeth and agreed. "There's also the syncopator. This needs to be faster." During this time, Luo Nan had already seen the sample of the processed bones that the veteran had brought over. After Dean Wan's technological improvements, there were no problems applying it to the syncopator. And the classic design of the syncopator had its own blueprint, so he didn't need to worry about it. The matters related to production and manufacturing came to an end. With a slight thought, the deformed exoskeleton frame on his body was taken off. Snake Tongue came over to sort it out. Jianghu had already taken his seat once more at this time. Luo Nan turned his face to face Jianghu. He got straight to the point. "Director Jiang, you've been waiting for a long time. I heard that you were looking for me?" Jianghu bowed. Please forgive me for taking the liberty to disturb you, sir. Luonan laughed. I wouldn't go so far as to disturb you. He sized up Jianghu as he spoke. It was said that this woman was quite accomplished in the field of genome engineering. She was also engaged in experiments that violated ethics. No matter how one looked at her, she was an introverted and shy woman. She was a typical technician who wasn't good at socializing. The polite words at the tip of her tongue were stiff. For her to specially come looking for him under these circumstances could only mean that the matter she wanted to express was extremely important. At least this was the case for her. Luonan was a bit curious. He said, I know that you and Master Shou are partners in close contact. With this layer of relationship, we don't need to be too polite. Just speak your mind and increase efficiency. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mo. Jianghu took a deep breath and bowed once more. This time the extent was even greater. I've come this time in hopes of obtaining the tissue sample of Mr. Mo's summoned creature, the mushed-mouth ape. Please. Chapter 943. Jianghu's voice trembled slightly at the end of her words, but the words that came out of her mouth were still expressed clearly. The most important thing was that the contents of her words were truly unexpected. Luonan never expected that she would make such a request. He subconsciously looked at the veteran. The veteran had just arranged a production task for the factory. He saw Mr. Mo cast a gaze at him. What else could he do but smile bitterly? This was interesting. Speaking of which, ever since Luonan publicly summoned the mushed-mouth ape, this was the first person to come knocking and ask for it. It must be known that this was a key target linked to the new plane. Who knew how many people were drooling over the idea of getting their hands on it? But they were intimidated by the power displayed by Mr. Mo, and the fact that the summoned creature came and went without a trace. They could only watch helplessly from the side. What kind of path did Jianghu have? She actually came knocking on his door like this? Luonan felt that this was a bit absurd. He laughed and asked her, Director Jiang, is this request of yours personal in nature or business? Personal, Jianghu blurted out in response. Oh, so it's like this. Luonan declined to comment. Luonan knew about the conversation between Snake Tongue and Jianghu. Snake Tongue's actions were carried out under his tacit approval. However, this lady's position was far too vague. It was just like the appearance and temperament she displayed. They were separated by a layer of faintly discernible mist. It was like Luonan himself was covered by a veil of invisibility. Luonan decided to start with the most basic of questions. Director Jiang, you've seen Yuan X. Oh, this is what I call the mushed-mouth ape. You should have heard me say it when you were next to me. Its volume isn't small, but it's an energized existence. What do you mean by a tissue sample? Jianghu felt that she had already crossed a bottleneck when she wasn't blasted out by Mr. Mo on the spot. The nervousness in her heart eased a bit. She gently adjusted her breathing to make her voice a bit clearer. Mr. Mo, it's like this. I observed the mushed-mouth ape back then. It possessed an overall structural stability on the material plane. I have mastered a technique that allows me to cut out a basic unit from the bottom of the structure. I can preserve the basic structural properties without damaging the entirety of the structure, and I can maintain it for a certain amount of time for research. Luonan was astonished. You had ideas about it back then? Jianghu was a little embarrassed. He lowered his head and said, I've considered it. After all, it's related to my research. Luonan ran a circle through his mind. It was said that different professions were worlds apart. He didn't quite understand what Jianghu's so-called technology was. He also didn't know the specific contents of her research. He just felt that this didn't seem to be the field of genome engineering. You're researching the mushed-mouth ape or a similar mutant. It's hard to say if this thing is considered a mutant. According to his understanding of the lousy-mouth ape, this kind of pure energy structure was more like an idealized collection of configurations. If he were to do it, he would have to start from the thinking of configurations and dismantle it from top to bottom or from bottom to top in order to keep the meaningful parts. Obviously, this was not going to be easy. From top to bottom, it was like decomposing a large number into prime factors with bare hands. At first glance, the principle seemed easy to understand, but when the quantity and complexity of the number exceeded the threshold, the human brain would explode. Going from the bottom to the top was very likely to get lost in the maze of the basic structure of the configuration, wasting brain time and energy, only to find that after going around in a circle, they were back to the starting point. What method did Jianghu use to research? However, Jianghu denied this aspect. I know. I'm not researching any type of mutant, but I do have a need to collect samples of diversity. Luonan was curious. What kind of specific direction? Jianghu responded without the slightest hesitation. The ecology of the distributed mutant gene network. It's the design of an ecological network built on the basis of genetic diversity. We hope to use the genes of mutants on a large scale as the basic level. We hope to stimulate a new and higher level through their sufficient connection, cooperation, learning and competition. In the form of extraordinary power. Luonan frowned. It sounds a bit like an artificial neural network. Actually, they both adopt the mathematical model of a sparse and distributed network. However, there will be differences in the application. The academic discussion stopped here. Luonan had no intention of getting too involved in this unfamiliar field. Otherwise he might make a fool of himself. He caught onto another key word. You said we. This doesn't seem like a private request. Is the Songping Research Institute still operating? I remember that they've been selling their assets all this time. They feel that the limelight has passed, so they're starting to fill in again? Jianghu was a bit nervous when she saw Luonan's doubt. She explained, I don't understand the operation of the Great Zay Order. I'm asking for a tissue sample for the sake of the following research. Of course it has nothing to do with the Great Zay Order. As far as I know, the research institute you're in is privately funded by Matsudaira Yoshio. This research project. I brought it with me. Jianghu's rebuttal blurted out, but there was a stumble in the middle. It dispelled her emotions more or less. Then her voice weakened a bit, but it was still a lot harder than before. I've already signed an agreement with the Research Institute. They've only obtained the patent related to the field of directional induction for this project. The rest is still with me. That should be the most valuable part. Research results often keep a distance from should. Veteran coughed over and over to the side. Jianghu finally came to her senses. Her emotions had gotten to her head. Her face was a bit pale. She tried to apologize, but she didn't know what to say for a time. On the other side, Luonan saw that Jianghu was so nervous that her fists were clenched, but her body movements were still forcefully not falling apart. The key thing was that veteran was smiling at the side. He looked at Luonan with an impatient expression. Luonan's heart softened, and he eased up with a sentence. Never mind. I'm not interested in how you guys sign the agreement. If it's the employer behind you, it'll be a bit interesting. Employer? Jianghu was still too nervous, so much so that she was a bit slow. Veteran comforted her again. Mr. Imo, are you talking about the LCRF? Jianghu immediately reacted. Indeed, with the level of strength displayed by Mr. Imo, the size of the Great Zay Order was indeed not within the scope of his attention. Those that could be linked to him were certainly of a higher level. For example, behind Matsudaira Yoshio's private research institute was an even larger investment organization, the LCRF, which was also known as the Life Cycle Research Fund. Luonan had diverted the topic. Veteran was naturally willing to cooperate. He intentionally used chatter to ease up the atmosphere. I'd say that the LCRF isn't very interested in Jianghu's research. The uncertainties are too strong, and it's a long and drawn-out project. It's been over 20 years from the beginning until now. It's not that there aren't any results, but there hasn't been a single person who's been able to prolong their lives. Those fellows who are older and weaker than me are probably just waiting to die if they really rely on this. The rest of them can't wait any longer. Veteran laughed heartily as he spoke. Luonan laughed as well. What the veterans were referring to was the mockery of the ability users' sense of superiority towards the previous generations, who had great capital and power but could not activate supernatural powers, and ended up kneeling before diseases and death and weeping their hearts out. He spoke again. From the Wilderness Laboratory to Quantum Corporation, they've been fighting for 3 days even if they don't have dates. They're really going crazy from hunger. Luonan added in his mind, from the safe trade zone of Ban City to the deep blue world. Ever since the era of distortion, especially after the appearance of powerful mythical existences like ability users and extraordinaries, those in power who were unable to catch up were driven mad with jealousy on one hand. On the other hand, they discovered the hope of prolonging their lives and vitality. Under the provocation of hope, a considerable portion of this group of people lost their composure. They did things more and more aggressively, disregarding everything. The LCRF was one of the batons they used to wield the power of capital. They had become more and more anxious in the past few years. At the same time, Luonan discovered a few emotional triggers from veterans' words. Master Shou has had dealings with the LCRF before? Meh. I don't have the qualifications. I've just seen a few things. It's all from a long time ago. In the past. It was when we were in the wilderness. It's a pity that it doesn't seem like friendship. Luo Nan's mind suddenly froze when he spoke to this point. He felt that it was a bit familiar. He looked at Jianghu across from him and remembered that this was a bit similar to the word Snake Tongue had said to him a few minutes ago. The trigger was friendship, but the keyword was a time expression like, in the past. Luo Nan's eyes narrowed. He paid attention to it in secret, but he didn't delve deeper into this field. He just casually made a summary. The claws of capital really are unfathomable. Veteran laughed. Clearly, Mr. Imo had forgotten that he controlled the Blood Flame Order and the Castle Financial Group, which was even more famous in the secular world. They were also outstanding and famous capital powers. From this, it could be seen that Mr. Imo didn't place his position on the side of capital. This was in line with his usual behavior, making Veteran feel closer to him. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot and help Jianghu speak up. But Mr. Imo shook his head. Honestly speaking, Director Zhang's research project has nothing to do with me. But if it involves the mushed-mouth ape, this very moment is far too sensitive. Veteran had already automatically entered the role of a lobbyist. He humbly asked for guidance. You're saying? I don't know how much you guys understand about this matter, but the current public situation is this. The mushed-mouth ape is involved in the secrets of a new plane. If its tissue sample can really be dismantled and leaked out. Luo Nan raised his hand to stop Jianghu's inclination to swear an oath. I'm saying that even if only the news is leaked out, who knows what those fellows who stare at the new plane day in and day out to the point that their eyes turn green from staring at it. Luo Nan cast his gaze at Jianghu. Think about it. If you get this tissue sample, maybe when you get off the yacht that go to Masayoshi, oh, even if he doesn't exist, there can still be Satoshi Maitu, Renzwudding, and so on. They can invite you onto the yacht and send you directly to the Amaterasu court. He was joking, but Jianghu and the veteran couldn't bring themselves to laugh. Luo Nan sighed when he saw their expressions. Looking at it from a different angle, Luo Nan really wanted to know whether or not the scientific research institutions of Earth could explore deeper secrets from the mushed-mouth ape's research, secrets that even he couldn't touch. Yes, he already knew that the cloud world was the product of the interaction between the mist labyrinth and Earth's local spacetime. He even wanted to borrow this basic logic for the virtual plane he would create in the future in order to quickly take shape. But why would a strange species like the mushed-mouth ape appear in the basic and clear structure of the cloud world? This was still an unsolved mystery. If he had a trustworthy research team under his command, he would have given it away by now. Oh, President Ouyang's side was actually pretty good. But it was just as he said before. It was unknown how big of a storm would be stirred if news were to leak out in this sensitive period. Luo Nan's mind stirred slightly when he thought of this. Another thought popped up in his mind. It seemed that stirring up a storm wasn't bad at all. He was somewhat unable to suppress this thought as soon as it appeared. But now wasn't the time to think things through in detail. Luo Nan retracted his attention and faced Veteran once more. Jianghu's expression grew all the more amiable. I discovered this thing by accident. It's not bad to be able to research and discover its deep secrets. However, now clearly isn't the time. Jianghu was already thrown into chaos by Luo Nan's hot and cold attitude. He even doubted the correctness of his request. He looked over in a daze when he heard Luo Nan's words. Luo Nan didn't beat around the bush with her. Let's postpone it for a few days. In the society of commodities, time nodes and sequence are the most suitable for marking prices. A step earlier or a step later will make a huge difference. You guys don't seem to be in a rush to get started right now? Yes. This is a part of the collection. It's used for high-level comparison groups. Jianghu suddenly understood when he spoke to this point. Mr. Mo had agreed. It didn't matter if it was due to the face of Veteran or some delaying tactic. For a powerful person of Mr. Mo's status, a promise was certainly better than nothing. Even if she wasn't able to take it back today, it would still be a consolation. A joyous expression appeared on her face. She got up from her seat and bowed deeply in thanks. But she heard Mr. Imo ask a question before she could say words of thanks. What's your segmentation tool? Sorry. I'm talking about the collection tool. Luo Nan clearly used the segmentation tool to his heart's content. Speaking of which, he really did want to use the segmentation tool to cut it and see what the result would be. Unfortunately, he didn't have an advanced artificial intelligence like Aunt Kuei. He also didn't have the enormous database accumulated by the Heavenly Yuan Empire. It would be quite difficult to make a comparison. While he was fantasizing, Jianghu answered without the slightest hesitation. It's a supernatural power that I possess. It's called dissociation. Luonan was a bit surprised. Jianghu really didn't have the slightest hint of an ability user. Even though he could sense a few characteristics, it was very easy to forget or overlook them. Jianghu didn't have the slightest intention of keeping it to himself. He explained seriously, my ability is mainly used to strip complex systems. It's used to generate reactions to stimuli from the external environment. However, it is limited by the complexity and precision of the system and unit. Can you demonstrate it? Of course. Jianghu immediately agreed. Since he was going to experiment, he obviously needed a target. What should he use? Luonan's gaze swept over Snake Tongue, but he soon shifted it away. She had enough bad luck these past few days and she was in front of others. It would be good to give her a bit of face. He himself wasn't suitable. Veteran was a guest. He couldn't really bring out Yuan X. Luonan's thoughts spun a few times and he came up with a plan. He snapped his fingers. It'll be this little thing? Sorry for my lack of manners. As Jianghu spoke, a fingernail-sized large ant-like life form appeared on the short table in front of him. It swaggered over. Its entire body was scarlet red, and it reflected the lighting in the living room. It seemed to sparkle with a flame-like luster. Vulcan ant. This was a Vulcan ant that had been transported over from a Vulcan ant nest several thousand kilometers away in the lava caverns. This was a magical technique and it possessed an inconceivable core. In any case, Veteran and Jianghu were both stupefied as they watched. Luonan let out a secret sigh of relief after finishing this task. Right now, the range of his soul cloak had shrunk completely. It couldn't even cover the entire civilian market. The altar's spiderweb was a bit rotten, and he needed the Wraith sign to work anew to mend it. However, his soul strength was still rapidly proliferating under the special structure of formatting theory. It was far beyond the reach of normal ability users, and it was endlessly recovering. Moreover, his control over the targets he had previously controlled didn't decline at all. This reflected the stability of the dark chains, a fundamental ability. Completing this fixed-point transmission basically clarified the bottom line of his strength. Back to the matter at hand. The Vulcan ant was a social mutant species. It was controlled, small in size and simple in internal structure. It was quite suitable to be used as a target for a demonstration. Luonan looked at Jianghu, but Jianghu was stupefied. Is it too small? I know. I've done it before. Jianghu raised his head and quickly swept a glance over. Then he lowered his eyelids. His breathing and heartbeat were a bit chaotic, but he still extended his hand toward the Vulcan ant. The large ant, which seemed to be flowing with a bloody glow, followed along Jianghu's finger under Luonan's telepathic command. It climbed all the way up and quickly climbed to the hollow of her palm. Jianghu adjusted her breathing once more. Then she closed her palm and fingers, then separated them a moment later. During this time, the Vulcan ant didn't attack her under Luonan's control. It was as if it had completed a checkout mission. It climbed down without any abnormalities. It's done. Jianghu's voice was a bit shaky. Perhaps it was due to the consumption of energy from using her ability. The veteran, to the side, had already seen this sort of scene many times. He coughed and wanted to open his mouth to explain. But Luonan didn't need this. He had already captured the undetectable red dot in the hollow of Jianghu's palm through his keen perception. This is a parasol sac? From the perspective of the mutant Vulcan ant, the parasol sac was no longer a place to store food. Instead, it was an existence that had mutated into an ammunition warehouse. The semi-finished neurotoxin stored here could form a powerful zombie virus that dominated the target's nervous system through mixing with the secretions from the gland, tail, and other different areas. It could also be used as a stimulant to stimulate the individual's energy. At the same time, it was an important additive for the pheromone needed for collective activities. It could be said to be one of the most critical organs. Luonan looked at the Vulcan ant on the short table. It was actually at a loss. Luonan nearly applauded. What a marvelous displacement. Upon closer examination, there should be some subtle space-time related elements within. But the most marvelous part was the instantaneous deconstruction and reorganization of the local tissue. Unfortunately, the details were quite chaotic. There seemed to be quite a bit of redundancy. It was yet another black box. Over on Earth, as long as supernatural powers were involved, many had the characteristics of a black box. They knew how, but they didn't know why. In the end, it was because the structure wasn't systematic and the research wasn't deep enough. In any case, this was a very interesting ability. If used properly, it could even be a very terrifying ability. Luo Nen felt that he didn't lose out by being able to see this demonstration. Chapter 944. Old Hand and Jiang Zhong left. As they exited the cabin, they bumped into Yin Lu, who had sent them over. Yin Lu politely wanted to send them off the airship, but they refused. Basically, the two bid farewell in a calm mood. This was in line with Luo Nan's expectations. Sir's heart is too good. Yin Lu said this as soon as she entered. She was suspicious of flattery, but part of it was from the bottom of her heart. She hesitated for a moment before saying, "The human heart is subtle. If Sir's attitude is too kind, it might not be a good thing for them." Luo Nan was arranging the parts around him, trying to piece them back together. He didn't even raise his head when he heard this. Master Shou isn't that kind of person. As for Jiang Zhong, he doesn't seem like one either. His words were uncertain, but his tone was flat. This was because this wasn't the main point of Luo Nan's attention. In comparison, he felt that the relationship between the two was more worth exploring. The friendship between Master Shou and Jiang Zhong is extremely deep. It's not at the level of an ordinary collaborator. Yin Lu pulled out the relevant information. Yes, it's closer than what the information shows. However, Master Shou's Hengduan 7 tribes has a much more tense relationship with Jiang Zhong. Their relationship with Jiang Zhong is the relationship between a researcher and a lab rat. A considerable number of people have a very bad impression of Jiang Zhong. On the day she and Master Shou were kidnapped, some people even suspected that it was a trick she played. Luo Nan's hands didn't stop assembling. He just spoke a bit slower. Under normal logic, even if the researcher felt pity for the lab rat, it's unlikely that the researcher would develop a friendship and relationship with the lab rat. That would be far too difficult. But the facts are there. How did this friendship come about? And when did it come about? Yin Lu roughly grasped Luo Nan's train of thought. She tried to make a judgment. If we exclude some complex physiological and psychological factors, pushing the time forward is more logical. This is before the Hengduan 7 tribes became living materials. They moved to Ban City in the first place to become living materials. Nominally, it was to provide social relief to the nomadic tribes of the wilderness that had suffered from the mutant infection. But in reality, everyone was clear. The research organization of Ban City's trade market wouldn't give them the time and space to make friends. Then we can only push it forward. The wilderness, Luo Nan said. Yin Lu quickly brought up the corresponding information. According to the information from the Great Zhe cult, there are rumors that Jiang Zhong was born in the wilderness. At least in the processing plants and research institutes, most people think so. Wilderness? This is the wilderness. Luo Nan paused his assembling actions for a moment. Then he casually swept his hand and cleared the table in front of him, letting the spare parts scatter to the ground. Then he took a fake vertebra joint used on load-bearing ridges and placed it in the middle of the table. What we can be 100% sure of is that before Master Shou came to Ban City, he was in the wilderness in Spring City, near the Hengduan mountain range. If Jiang Zhong got to know him in the wilderness, it's most likely here. Luo Nan placed another bionic joint on the table, placing it together with the one representing the veteran. He thought for a bit and separated them a bit. Using a veteran to anchor Jiang Zhong and her range of activities was a little arbitrary. Yin Lu continued. The same source of information indicates that the president of the Dazawa Society, Matsudaira Yoshio, is a close friend of Jiang Zhong, and it might even be a little ambiguous. The beginning of this relationship should also be in the wilderness. Matsudaira Yoshio, huh? Luo Nan had seen Matsudaira Yoshio's information before. It seemed that Matsudaira Yoshio was a powerful character, but Luo Nan's impression of Matsudaira Yoshio was still fuzzy in his mind. What attracted Luo Nan's attention was that Matsudaira Yoshio had once roamed the wilderness for a considerable amount of time. It was just that Matsudaira Yoshio was very secretive about where he went and what he did. Then again, no matter what sort of person Matsudaira Yoshio was, the friendship forged between him and Jiang Zhong in that complicated and dangerous environment had been tempered for so many years. Most likely it was true friendship. He swept a glance at Snake Tongue. There was still another piece of circumstantial evidence for this matter. Luo Nan's thoughts entered a state of linear deduction. A long time ago, a friend in the wilderness. There were far too many possibilities in terms of specific locations without the anchor point of veteran. However, if Old Hand was added, Luonan would have to seek an intersection, and the range would suddenly narrow. But then, Luonan picked up another bionic joint and placed it on the table. Could Matsudaira Yoshio and veteran be old acquaintances? There's no evidence to prove this. Yeah. Wouldn't the relationship be too complicated if he followed this line of deduction? Could it be that Jiang Zhong and even Matsudaira Yoshio were old acquaintances? Luo Nan grasped the bionic joint in the palm of his hand and flipped through the external neuron to search for information. In the past, He Yuan had recently asked Yin Lu to search the information market for some information regarding his grandfather Luo Yuandao's scientific research ethics case. He would flip through it when he had nothing to do. Unsurprisingly, there were no records of any connection. And this was the most detailed information Luo Nan could find in the early days. As for the wilderness laboratory stage, it was the late 70s and early 80s. The world government was still in a difficult strategic defense phase against the mutants in the wilderness. They had practically no influence over the refugee powers. Even the intelligence organizations of the inner world didn't have many methods to deal with the chaotic and bloody wilderness. It was very difficult to gather intelligence. After going back and forth many times, Luonen felt that it would be better to listen to his aunt Luo Shuqing's memories. Forget it. I'll just pay attention for now. Luo Nan placed the third bionic joint on the edge of the table. He played it down on the surface, but he had already made a decision in his heart. He would wait until his mental plane's condition had more or less recovered. He would start from this angle and completely monitor Jiang Zhong and Matsudaira Yoshio's movements. Or he could simply draw up psychic diagrams and attempt divination. He could see if he could erase the uncertainties from the perspective of supernatural powers. Oh, speaking of psychic diagrams, why did he come to Ban City in the first place? With a thought, the exoskeleton frame's contents automatically switched out in Luonan's virtual workspace. What replaced it was Luonan's newest work in Xia City. It was on this psychic diagram that the luxurious jadeite light cruise ship was tapped, and a certain image was drawn. Yin-Lu knew that Luonan was deep in thought. She carefully controlled her breathing for fear of disturbing him. It was just that every time Luonan was deep in thought, there would always be some abnormalities around him. This time, aside from the contents of the virtual workspace being switched, the three bionic joints on the table were rolling under the influence of some invisible power until they spun and spun. There was also a blood-red ant the size of a thumb. It seemed to be the one that had been used as an experimental subject just now. It had crawled back from the opposite table. Unfortunately, its luck tonight was abysmal. It had just climbed onto the table when it was run over by a rolling bionic joint. Perhaps it hit its vitals? In any case, it immediately erupted with a blood-colored flame and was burned to ashes. Luo Nan's gaze locked onto the fire of the fire god ant that exploded and then extinguished as well as the remaining ashes. He appeared to be deep in thought. And at this time, Yin-Lu noticed that Snake Tongue was silently retreating. Her eyebrows were knitted together as if she had encountered some problem. There were some fluctuations in the mental domain. What's the matter? Even Yin-Lu noticed the abnormality on the mental plane. There was no need to talk about Luo Nan. He even confirmed the source of the disturbance. His gaze turned to Snake Tongue and her figure paused. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "Reporting to my lord. It's Wujiawei, calling for help." Oh. Luo Nan had been staying at the trade market for the past few days, which was also the northern shore of Northern Mountain Lake. He had nearly completely forgotten about the big guy on the southern shore. But when Snake Tongue mentioned it, the image of the giant camphor tree spirit immediately appeared in his mind. Calling for help. Oh, I nearly forgot. What's the situation like with the powers of the Orders of Order of Ban City these past 2 days? Yin-Lu replied, "They're all unsettled. The Fusang Divine Tree system revealed itself that day, and it scared quite a few people. Plus, everyone says that the true God is in a terrible mood these past 2 days. There are a few more venting barrels and scapegoats in the dark." They're just venting barrels? Luonan didn't believe it at all. Speaking of which, what in the world were the Pope and the true God going to set up in Ban City? What were they cooking? The current Luonan's insight and knowledge were different from when he first arrived in Ban City. It didn't matter if they were aberrations or whatever. They were born with a spirit, received the power of faith and could operate and evolve. This was already in the category of fantasy breeds. It wasn't just the Zhujiawei men. According to the taxonomy of species of the Heavenly Yuan Empire, the so-called gods consecrated by the thousands of orders of Order of Ban City could be classified into the category of fantasy breeds. Yes, that's right. In the standard sense, fantasy breeds referred to creatures that didn't have a natural material foundation. They were pure creations of consciousness, desire, and information. However, in the actual process of development, there would often be a trigger in the distorted process of desire and cognition. There were also such examples on Earth, including mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, birds and beasts, natural phenomena, and even ancient sages and heroes. All of these could become the cornerstone of faith. Of course, this was just the initial stage of fantasy breeds. Truly powerful fantasy breeds would inevitably break away from the shackles of concrete objects, physical properties, and images. They would expand their domain of influence as much as possible. For example, the magnetic optical mica. Its original form was very likely to be a white cloud that could be entrusted with one's imagination. However, in the long process of evolution and growth, it accepted more and more elements of imagination and desire from trillions of intelligent life forms. In the end, it was fixed on the spacetime element of imagination. It was said that one could see 10,000 kilometers away and wish to fall beyond the heavens. There were also studies that showed that the original form of the magnetic optical mica was an experimental configuration invented by a powerful existence. It was just that it took the shape of a white cloud. Only with an extraordinary foundation could it possess a variety of terrifying abilities that were powerful and extraordinary. Of course, this wasn't within the development of fantasy breeds. Speaking of experiments, Yin Lu and Snake Tongue were ruthlessly abandoned by Luonan's train of thought. Luonan didn't pay attention to them. He just thought that he seemed to have heard Liang Lu mention something before. In history, fantasy breeds were indeed extremely important research targets. They were a kind of special transitional element. They themselves had an extremely important meaning. A few relatively clear concepts spun in his mind and he suddenly hit a certain trigger point. The external neuron's built-in database search function was activated. One professional thesis after another and arranged neatly appeared in Luonan's sea of consciousness. Why wasn't he this sensitive in the past? Luonan brought back his past self and felt sour about his present self. But after thinking a bit more, he felt that it was reasonable. This sort of telepathic trigger function. If he didn't have the abyss of heaven style of thought, how could the abyss of heaven style of thinking be realized? The most important thing was the content of the relevant materials. Luonan relied on the translation function of his secret glyph to hastily sweep through them. At least within the scope of his field of vision, the topics were different. The keywords and introductions were more or less repetitive. Aside from the words fantasy breed, magnetic optical mica, and so on, there were other words like system, kingdom of God, medium, precondition, and so on. Did I search them? Luonan's gaze fell upon the article at the very top of the list. Configuration, faith, and great limit. The rational reconstruction of historical evolution from ignorance to dawn. The magnetic optical mica chapter. Oh, I feel like this is a large work. A part of it. Luonan noticed this. Aside from being at the very top of the list, there was also the word configuration at the very top. But before he could translate the introduction a step further, he first noticed the author. This was a name that he wasn't familiar with, but he was rather sensitive to some time ago. Azure and Blue. John. Holy crap. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.